How could entire civilizations, towering in their glory, simply vanish from the face of the earth, leaving behind only enigmatic ruins and haunting questions? Across the globe, from the jungles of Central America to the remote islands of the Pacific, the silent stones of ancient cities whisper stories of forgotten peoples, sophisticated cultures, and sudden, inexplicable collapses. These are not mere legends but historical realities, puzzle pieces from our collective past that modern science is desperately trying to assemble. Each vanished civilization, from the Maya to the inhabitants of Easter Island, presents a unique mystery, a stark reminder of the fragility of human achievement. Their rise and fall offer profound lessons about the intricate dance between humanity, nature, and the relentless currents of time. Consider the classic Maya civilization, whose magnificent city-states once dominated the Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala, and Belize, reaching their zenith between 250 and 900 AD. These were masters of astronomy, mathematics, and writing, creating an intricate calendar more accurate than the one used in Europe at the time. Massive stone pyramids, like those at Tikal and Palenque, pierced the jungle canopy, testaments to the power and devotion of their rulers. Yet, by the time the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, these great urban centers were silent, overgrown, and abandoned. What catastrophic event could compel millions of people to desert their sophisticated cities, their palaces, and their sacred temples? For decades, archaeologists have debated the cause of the Maya collapse, piecing together clues from pollen samples, lakebed sediments, and stone carvings. Recent studies reveal that a series of prolonged and severe droughts, lasting years or even decades, struck the region during the 9th century, crippling agriculture and destabilizing the political order. This environmental stress was likely exacerbated by intense warfare between competing city-states, as evidenced by the sudden appearance of fortified walls and mass graves in the archaeological record. Theories suggest that the combination of crop failure, resource scarcity, and endless conflict led to a complete societal breakdown. It was not a single apocalypse, but a perfect storm of interconnected factors that brought the classic Maya world to its knees. Thousands of miles away, on one of the most isolated islands on Earth, a different society faced its own astonishing rise and fall. Rapa Nui, known in the West as Easter Island, is a tiny volcanic speck in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, over 2,000 miles from the nearest inhabited land. Here, the ancestors of the Polynesian settlers carved nearly 1,000 colossal stone statues known as moai from volcanic tuff. These figures, some towering over 30 feet high and weighing up to 80 tons, were transported for miles across the island without the aid of modern technology or even large beasts of burden. The central question that has captivated scientists for generations is how a small, isolated community achieved such monumental feats, and more importantly, why did their civilization ultimately collapse? For many years, the dominant theory was one of dramatic ecocide, a cautionary tale of environmental self-destruction. According to this model, the Rapa Nui people deforested their entire island, using the massive palm trees as rollers and levers to move their moai. Pollen analysis confirms that the island was once heavily forested, but was rendered completely treeless by the time of European contact. This deforestation led to severe soil erosion, the loss of resources for building canoes, ending fishing, and widespread starvation, which in turn sparked social chaos and warfare, culminating in the toppling of the very statues they had worked so hard to erect. However, more recent research has added layers of complexity and nuance to this story, suggesting the collapse may not have been as swift or simple as once believed. Some archaeologists now argue that the Polynesian rats, which arrived with the first settlers and reproduced rapidly, were the primary drivers of deforestation by eating the palm tree seeds. Furthermore, evidence suggests the Rapa Nui people were highly adaptable, developing intensive gardening techniques to survive without large trees. While environmental stress undoubtedly played a role, the arrival of Europeans in the 18th century, bringing disease and the slave trade, delivered a devastating final blow to a society already in a state of profound transformation, shattering its culture forever. Far to the east, along the fertile plains of the Indus River, a civilization as advanced as its contemporaries in Egypt and Mesopotamia emerged around 3300 BC. The Indus Valley civilization, with its great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, covered a vast area larger than either of those ancient empires. Its citizens lived in well-planned cities laid out on precise grid patterns, with private homes, public wells, and a sophisticated system of sanitation and underground drains that would not be seen in Europe for millennia. They produced intricate seals, bronze figurines, and cotton textiles, yet their script remains undeciphered, their language lost to time. Around 1900 BC, this great urban civilization began a slow but steady decline, its cities gradually shrinking and being abandoned. Unlike the fall of Rome, there is no evidence of a single catastrophic invasion. The leading theory points to a major climate shift that caused the monsoon patterns to change and the vital Saraswati River, upon which many Indus settlements depended, to dry up completely. This slow-moving environmental disaster would have decimated agriculture, forcing the population to migrate eastward toward the more reliable Ganges Plain. This gradual exodus explains why archaeologists find no single collapse layer of destruction, only the slow, silent encroachment of dust and emptiness over the course of centuries. On the island of Crete, another Bronze Age civilization flourished, its power rooted not in conquest, but in trade and its unique maritime culture. The Minoans, named after the mythical king Minos, dominated the Aegean Sea from around 2000 to 1450 BC, establishing a powerful thalassocracy based at the sprawling, labyrinthine palace of Knossos. Their art is vibrant and celebratory, depicting scenes of bull leaping, graceful dolphins, and elaborately dressed figures in a society that appears to have been remarkably peaceful for its time. They were skilled engineers and artists, exporting pottery, olive oil, and precious metals across the Mediterranean world, influencing cultures as far-flung as mainland Greece and Egypt. The sudden and violent end of Minoan dominance is now strongly linked to one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in human history. Around 1600 BC, the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, exploded in a cataclysm that dwarfed the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The blast sent a towering ash cloud into the stratosphere, which may have triggered climatic cooling worldwide, and it generated a massive tsunami that slammed into the northern coast of Crete, destroying its ports and its fleet. While the Minoans survived the initial eruption, this disaster crippled their economy and left them vulnerable, paving the way for the Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland to eventually conquer the island and absorb the remnants of their magnificent culture. In the heart of North America, a civilization of builders arose that has been largely omitted from traditional historical narratives. Cahokia, located just across the Mississippi River from modern-day St. Louis, Missouri, was the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. At its peak around 1050 AD, this sprawling urban center of the Mississippian culture was home to as many as 20,000 people, a population that exceeded that of contemporary London. The most prominent feature of Cahokia is Monk's Mound, an immense earthen structure covering over 14 acres and rising 100 feet into the air, the base of the residence of the civilization's paramount chief. Yet, by 1400 AD, Cahokia was completely abandoned, its great plazas empty and its wooden structures gone, leaving only the mysterious earthen mounds as evidence of its existence. The reasons for its disappearance remain a subject of intense debate among archaeologists, who have no written records from the Cahokians themselves. Some theories point to environmental degradation, as the large population may have overhunted the area and depleted nearby forests, leading to soil erosion and a decline in agricultural productivity. Other hypotheses suggest that political turmoil, social unrest, or a changing climate that affected corn yields could have led to a gradual dispersal of the population back to smaller, more sustainable villages. In the deserts of present-day Jordan, another remarkable civilization, the Nabateans, carved a kingdom out of the rose-red sandstone cliffs. Their capital, Petra, was a marvel of engineering and urban planning, a vibrant trading hub nestled in a secluded valley. The Nabateans were masters of water management, creating a complex network of dams, cisterns, and clay water pipes that allowed them to capture and store every precious drop of rainwater, turning their desert city into an oasis. By controlling the lucrative trade routes for frankincense and spices that passed through their territory, they amassed incredible wealth, which they used to build breathtaking tombs, temples, and a monumental theater carved directly into the rock face. The decline of Petra was not sudden, but a slow, protracted process driven by shifting geopolitics and a natural disaster. When the Roman Empire annexed the Nabatean kingdom in 106 AD, the focus of regional trade gradually began to shift northward to newer cities on the coast and in Syria, like Palmyra. This slow economic erosion was compounded by a catastrophic earthquake in 363 AD, which destroyed many of Petra's famous buildings and critically damaged its vital water management system. Unable to recover their economic prominence, the city dwindled, and by the early Islamic period, it was little more than a small village, its magnificent grandeur lost to the Western world for over 1,000 years until its rediscovery in 1812. While an earthquake contributed to the quiet abandonment of Petra, another geological force, born of the planet's inner fire, was capable of reshaping entire continents and altering the course of human history in a matter of days. Volcanoes, the great vents of the Earth, have been both creators and destroyers, their fertile slopes nurturing early civilizations, while their sudden fury burying cities and chilling the global climate. The story of humanity is intertwined with these titanic forces, from the ash that preserved Roman life to the aerosols that triggered global famines. These are not merely natural disasters, but pivotal moments, violent geological events that directly influenced politics, migration, art, and the fate of empires, leaving an indelible mark on the historical record. The echoes of their explosive power continue to resonate, reminding us of our planet's immense and unpredictable dynamism. In the remote highlands of Iceland in 1783, the Earth split open along a 27-kilometer fissure known as Laki, unleashing the largest lava flow in historical times. For 8 grueling months, the Laki fissure erupted with terrifying intensity, spewing vast quantities of basaltic lava and, more critically, an unprecedented amount of poisonous gases into the atmosphere. An estimated 120 million tons of sulfur dioxide were released, which combined with atmospheric water vapor to form over 200 million tons of sulfuric acid aerosols. This toxic haze, often called the "3" or "4", spread across Europe, plunging it into a period of bizarre and deadly weather. The sun was described as blood red, a thick sulfurous fog blanketed the landscape, and acid rain burned the leaves off trees and corroded metal. The immediate consequences for Iceland were apocalyptic. Over half of the nation's livestock perished from eating contaminated grass or drinking fluoridated water, leading to a famine that killed approximately 25% of the island's population. But the eruption's reach was global, as the aerosol veil circled the northern hemisphere, acting as a planetary sunshade and causing significant surface cooling. The following winter of 1784 was one of the longest and coldest on record in North America, with the Mississippi River freezing at New Orleans and ice floating in the Gulf of Mexico. In Europe, the summer of 1783 was searingly hot, followed by an unbearably harsh winter, leading to catastrophic crop failures across France, Germany, and the British Isles. Some historians now argue that the widespread famine, poverty, and social unrest caused by Laki's climate disruption were a major contributing factor to the economic desperation that ignited the French Revolution in 1789. Long before Laki, in the year 79 AD, the prosperous Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum thrived in the shadow of a beautiful wooded mountain they knew only as Vesuvius. The people had long since forgotten its violent past, though seismic tremors, a common feature of the region, had been jolting the area for days, a warning the inhabitants did not understand. On the morning of August 24th, Vesuvius reawakened with a cataclysmic eruption column that soared over 30 kilometers into the sky, raining pumice and ash upon Pompeii, while a superheated pyroclastic flow instantaneously vaporized the residents of nearby Herculaneum. Our intimate knowledge of this event comes from the detailed letters of Pliny the Younger, who witnessed the disaster from across the bay and described the towering cloud as resembling a pine tree. The volcanic material perfectly preserved the city, creating a tragic but invaluable snapshot of Roman life, frozen in time under layers of hardened ash. The rediscovery of Pompeii in the 18th century provided a stunning window into the daily life, art, and architecture of the Roman Empire, profoundly influencing European culture and sparking a neoclassical revolution in art and design. For scientists, the tragedy of Vesuvius became the foundational event for volcanology, the study of volcanoes, allowing them to understand the mechanics of Plinian eruptions and their deadly pyroclastic flows. Vesuvius remains one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world today, with nearly 3 million people living in its shadow, a stark reminder of the vulnerability of modern metropolises to ancient geological threats. The eruption did not just end 2 cities, it gave birth to a new field of science and an enduring fascination with the suddenness of nature's power. It stands as a symbol of a civilization frozen at the peak and then utterly erased in a single, violent afternoon. If Vesuvius defined our understanding of a single city's fate, the eruption of Mount Tambora in the Dutch East Indies in 1815 redefined our understanding of a global catastrophe. Tambora's explosion on April 10, 1815, was the largest in recorded history, a volcanic explosivity index 7 event that was 10 times more powerful than Krakatoa and 100 times more powerful than Vesuvius. The initial blast was heard over 2,000 kilometers away, and the mountain itself lost over 1,500 meters of height, collapsing into a massive caldera. The immediate death toll on the island of Sumbawa was staggering, estimated at over 10,000 people killed by pyroclastic flows, with another 80,000 perishing in the following months from disease and famine. However, Tambora's true legacy was the atmospheric aftermath it unleashed upon the entire planet. The volcano injected an estimated 160 cubic kilometers of ash and, crucially, a massive volume of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, forming a global aerosol veil that blocked sunlight and dramatically lowered global temperatures. The year 1816 became infamous as the year without a summer, a period of climatic chaos that saw frosts in every month of the year across the northern hemisphere. Widespread crop failures led to devastating famines from New England to Germany, triggering food riots, mass migration, and the spread of historic epidemics like cholera. This bleak, cold summer also had unexpected cultural consequences. Trapped indoors by the relentless gloom at Lake Geneva in Switzerland, a young Mary Shelley was inspired to write her Gothic masterpiece, Frankenstein, while Lord Byron composed the poem Darkness. Tambora's eruption is a chilling case study in how a single geological event can trigger a cascade of environmental, social, and even artistic consequences across the globe. Just 68 years later, in 1883, the world witnessed another Indonesian cataclysm, this time from the island of Krakatoa in the Sunda Strait. Though smaller than Tambora, Krakatoa's eruption was arguably the loudest sound ever reported in modern history, a series of explosions that were clearly heard over 4,800 kilometers away in Australia and on the island of Rodriguez in the Indian Ocean. The final paroxysmal blast on August 17th ejected material to a height of over 80 kilometers and generated a series of immense tsunamis, some reaching heights of over 40 meters. These waves obliterated hundreds of coastal villages on the islands of Java and Sumatra, sweeping away entire communities and claiming the lives of more than 36,000 people, the vast majority dying from the tidal surges. Krakatoa's impact was global and visible. The fine ash and aerosols it created produced spectacular blood-red sunsets and crimson twilights around the world for nearly 3 years. These atmospheric phenomena were famously captured in the paintings of artists like William Ashcroft in London and are even believed to be the inspiration for the dramatic, fiery sky in Edvard Munch's masterpiece, The Scream. Scientifically, the eruption was a watershed moment, as it was the first major global catastrophe to be reported almost instantly as it happened, thanks to the newly established global telegraph network. Scientists worldwide were able to collect data on atmospheric pressure waves and barograph readings, piecing together a comprehensive planet-wide picture of the eruption's effects for the very first time. Krakatoa thus marked the birth of modern volcanology as a global collaborative science, transforming our ability to monitor and understand these immense geological events. Fast forward to the modern era, to May 18, 1980, in the Cascade Range of Washington State, where Mount St. Helens provided the world with a stark lesson in the violent unpredictability of even a well-monitored volcano. For 2 months, scientists had closely monitored a growing bulge on the mountain's north flank, a clear sign that magma was pushing upwards, and they had successfully lobbied for the establishment of a quote 6 to restrict access. On that fateful Sunday morning, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake triggered a massive landslide, the largest in recorded history, which uncapped the volcano's summit and depressurized its magma chamber in an instant. The result was a unique and terrifying lateral blast, a sideways explosion of hot gas, rock, and ash that flattened over 600 square kilometers of pristine forest in a matter of minutes. The eruption of Mount St. Helens was the most economically destructive volcanic event in U.S. history. But the restriction zone likely saved thousands of lives, demonstrating the immense value of modern volcanological monitoring. For scientists, it was an unparalleled opportunity to study eruption dynamics from start to finish, with sophisticated instruments recording every seismic tremor and ground deformation. The blast vaporized glaciers and created massive lahars, or volcanic mudflows, that choked rivers, destroyed bridges, and dumped enormous amounts of sediment downstream, reshaping the entire landscape. In the decades since, the area around St. Helens has become a living laboratory for studying ecological recovery, as life has slowly returned to the devastated pumice plain, offering profound insights into nature's resilience. The mountain stands as a powerful reminder that even in our technologically advanced age, the raw, elemental power of the earth remains a formidable and humbling force. While volcanoes like St. Helens unleash their power from above, another, often more sudden, force lies hidden beneath our feet, a silent architect of global change. This is the world of earthquakes, the violent shuddering of the Earth's crust as colossal tectonic plates grind against each other. These plates, driven by immense heat from the planet's core, are in constant, imperceptible motion. But when they lock, stress builds until it is released in a catastrophic burst of energy. From ancient cities swallowed by the sea to modern metropolises leveled in moments, earthquakes have repeatedly reshaped both the physical and human landscape. Their story is one of terrifying power, profound scientific discovery, and the enduring resilience of humanity in the face of nature's most unpredictable fury. Our journey into this seismic past begins in ancient Greece, in the year 373 before the Common Era, with the city of Helike. Situated on the Gulf of Corinth, Helike was a prosperous and revered city, the head of the Achaean League, and a prominent center for the worship of Poseidon, god of the sea. According to the accounts of ancient writers like Pausanias and Ovid, a catastrophic earthquake struck one winter night, causing the entire city to sink into the earth. A massive tsunami then rolled in from the sea, drowning the ruins and the frantic survivors, erasing Helike from the map so completely that for centuries it was believed to be a myth. Was this dramatic tale merely a fable? Or did a real city truly vanish in a single day? For 2,000 years, the lost city of Helike tantalized historians and archaeologists, its fate becoming a potential source for Plato's legend of Atlantis. It was not until the late 20th century that a dedicated team, led by Greek archaeologist Dora Katsanopoulou, began a systematic search using geological and historical texts. Their breakthrough came in 2001, when they finally uncovered the ruins of a classical city buried beneath a thick layer of clay and river sediment in an inland lagoon near the village of Rizamilos. Corroborated by the discovery of scattered pottery and evidence of a violent seismic event, the findings confirmed the ancient accounts. Cahokia had indeed been destroyed by an earthquake and subsequently submerged. This discovery validated ancient texts and provided a stunning archaeological example of how a single seismic event can obliterate an entire civilization, leaving behind only a ghost story. Fast forward to the 18th century, to November 1st, 1755, a date that would shake Europe to its very core, both literally and philosophically. On this All Saints' Day, as the devout citizens of Lisbon, Portugal were attending morning mass, the ground began to convulse with unimaginable violence. A massive earthquake, now estimated to have been a magnitude 8.5 to 9.0, ripped through the city, its epicenter in the Atlantic Ocean. The violent shaking lasted for 3 to 6 long minutes, collapsing thousands of buildings, including magnificent churches, hospitals, and the royal palace. In a matter of moments, one of the wealthiest and most illustrious cities in Europe was reduced to rubble and dust. But the devastation was not over. The initial quake was merely the prelude to a compound catastrophe of almost biblical proportions. Approximately 40 minutes after the shaking stopped, the citizens who had fled to the open, relatively safe space of the city's waterfront saw a terrifying sight. The waters of the Tagus River estuary suddenly receded, revealing sunken ships and lost cargo on the seafloor, before a massive tsunami, estimated at over 5 meters high, came roaring back to shore. The waves swept thousands of people, along with ships and debris, far into the city, drowning those who had survived the earthquake. As if this were not enough, the fires started by toppled candles and ruptured kitchen stoves in the ruined buildings quickly merged into a raging firestorm that burned for days, consuming what little was left of Lisbon. The impact of the Lisbon earthquake extended far beyond the borders of Portugal, triggering a profound crisis of faith and philosophy across Enlightenment Europe. The death toll was staggering, estimated between 40,000 and 50,000 people, a loss of life that shocked the continent. How could a benevolent and rational God allow such horrific suffering to befall so many, especially on a holy day? The event directly inspired thinkers like Voltaire to write his famous satire Candide, a scathing critique of the philosophical optimism of the time, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau to question the wisdom of building dense cities. The Lisbon disaster marked a turning point, forcing Western thought to grapple with the problem of natural evil and planting the seeds for modern seismology and urban planning for disaster risk reduction. In the modern era, no seismic event has demonstrated the terrifying global reach of a tsunami more than the Indian Ocean earthquake of December 26, 2004. It began deep beneath the seabed off the west coast of northern Sumatra, where a massive rupture occurred along a 1,200-kilometer stretch of the fault line between the Indo-Australian and Burmese plates. The earthquake itself was colossal, a magnitude 9.1 to 9.3, the third largest ever recorded, and it lasted for nearly 10 minutes, the longest duration ever observed. In that instant, the seabed was violently uplifted by several meters, displacing an estimated 30 cubic kilometers of seawater and unleashing a series of waves that would radiate outwards with the speed of a jetliner. Because the earthquake occurred deep beneath the ocean, its immediate effects were not fully understood by those on land, and there was no warning system in place for the Indian Ocean. The tsunami waves, traveling at speeds of up to 800 kilometers per hour, struck the coast of the Indonesian province of Aceh within 15 minutes, with some waves reaching heights of over 30 meters. The wall of water swept inland for several kilometers, obliterating entire communities like Banda Aceh and Mulabo in a matter of minutes. Over the next several hours, the waves continued their path of destruction, striking the coastlines of Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, and even reaching as far as Somalia and Kenya on the east coast of Africa, more than 7 hours after the initial quake. The human cost of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami was almost incomprehensible, a scale of loss that is difficult to fathom. The final death toll climbed to over 230,000 people, with millions more injured, displaced, or left without access to food, water, or shelter. The disaster triggered an unprecedented global humanitarian response, with billions of dollars in aid pouring into the affected regions from around the world. In the wake of this tragedy, the world recognized the critical need for a regional early warning system, leading to the establishment of the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning and Mitigation System in 2005. It was a terrible lesson written in the lives of hundreds of thousands, one that ultimately made the world a safer place for future generations. Just 7 years later, on March 11, 2011, the world witnessed again the terrifying power of a megathrust earthquake, this time off the coast of Tohoku, Japan. At 2:46 in the afternoon, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake, the most powerful to ever strike Japan and the fourth largest in the world since modern record-keeping began, ruptured the seabed. Japan is arguably the most seismically prepared nation on Earth, with strict building codes and a sophisticated early warning system. As a result, the skyscrapers of Tokyo swayed dramatically but did not collapse, and many residents received seconds of warning via their mobile phones, a testament to the power of preparedness to mitigate earthquake damage. However, the devastating power of the Pacific Ocean was about to test the limits of even Japan's formidable defenses. Less than an hour after the quake, a massive tsunami struck the Sanriku coast of northeastern Japan. While many seawalls, some over 10 meters high, had been built to protect against historical tsunamis, they were completely overwhelmed by waves that reached heights of up to 40 meters in some areas. The unstoppable wall of water swept inland for up to 10 kilometers in places, obliterating entire towns like Minami Sanriku and Ofunado, and carrying cars, homes, and debris miles inland. The sheer force of the water was so great that it even moved the entire island of Honshu, the main island of Japan, by an estimated 2.4 meters. The compound disaster did not end with the destruction of coastal communities. The tsunami's true, long-lasting horror was unleashed upon the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. The plant's emergency diesel generators, designed to power the cooling systems for the reactors in the event of a power outage, were located in the basements and were completely flooded and disabled by the tsunami waves. Without cooling, the cores of 3 of the plant's 6 reactors overheated, leading to nuclear meltdowns, hydrogen gas explosions that blew the roofs off the reactor buildings, and the release of significant amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere and the ocean. The event became the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl in 1986, a chilling cascade of technological failures triggered by a natural force of unimaginable scale. To understand the birth of earthquake science in America, we must return to April 18, 1906, when the city of San Francisco was violently awakened by a massive tremor emanating from the San Andreas Fault. The earthquake, with an estimated magnitude of 7.9, struck just after 5 in the morning, its violent shaking lasting for less than a minute but causing immense destruction. Brick buildings crumbled, wooden frames splintered, and the city's gas mains were ruptured across the city, igniting dozens of fires that quickly coalesced into a single, uncontrollable firestorm. For 3 days the fire burned, consuming over 28,000 buildings and leaving more than 3/4 of San Francisco's population homeless. The destruction of San Francisco, while a national tragedy, became the catalyst for a profound scientific revolution in the understanding of earthquakes. In the aftermath, geologist G.K. Gilbert from the U.S. Geological Survey conducted a field study of the surface rupture, observing that the ground had shifted horizontally by as much as 6 meters along the fault line. This was a crucial observation that directly challenged the prevailing theory that earthquakes were caused by vertical ground movements. Gilbert's work, along with the subsequent research of Harry Fielding Reid, led to the development of the quote 7, which correctly explained that earthquakes are the result of a sudden release of stored strain energy as rocks on either side of a fault slip. The ashes of San Francisco gave rise to modern seismology, providing the foundational knowledge that would eventually evolve into the revolutionary theory of plate tectonics. While the Earth itself reshaped empires through fire and water, the ambitions of men did so through steel and strategy, carving new borders on the world map with the edge of a sword. Throughout history, Single days of brutal conflict have acted as cataclysmic events, abruptly ending one era and violently giving birth to another. These were not mere skirmishes, but pivotal turning points where the fate of millions was decided by courage, cunning, and chance. Archaeological evidence and meticulously chronicled accounts allow us to stand on these distant fields and witness the moments that changed everything. From the ancient Near East to the fields of modern Europe, the echoes of these battles still shape our political boundaries, our languages, and our cultural identities. One of the earliest battles to be recorded in detail is the Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BCE, between the great Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite king Muwatalli II. The conflict centered on the strategic city of Kadesh in modern-day Syria, a vital prize controlling trade routes between the two superpowers of the Late Bronze Age. According to Egyptian accounts, largely preserved on the walls of temples like Luxor and Abu Simbel, Ramesses, in his youthful arrogance, divided his forces and was ambushed by the hidden Hittite army. The Egyptian accounts paint a dramatic picture of Ramesses single-handedly fighting off the Hittite chariotry, a tale of divine intervention that borders on mythology. Modern historians, however, believe the battle was likely a tactical stalemate, a disastrous ambush from which the Egyptians barely escaped, but one that failed to deliver a knockout blow to either side. The true significance of Kadesh lies not in the military outcome, but in its diplomatic aftermath, which makes it arguably more decisive than a simple victory. Faced with a new threat from the rising Assyrian Empire and exhausted by years of conflict, both Egypt and the Hittites sought a lasting peace. This resulted in the Kadesh Peace Treaty, the earliest known surviving peace treaty in the world, a copy of which is famously carved on the walls of the United Nations in New York. The treaty established mutually agreed-upon borders and called for a defensive alliance against future aggressors, a revolutionary concept for the time. Archaeological discoveries, including Hittite versions of the treaty found in their capital Hattusa, confirm this remarkable diplomatic achievement. The Battle of Kadesh, therefore, changed the world not by conquest, but by demonstrating that empires could be maintained through negotiation and international law, a precedent that would echo through millennia. Fast forward 3 centuries to the year 331 BCE, where on the plains of Gaugamela in present-day northern Iraq, a young Macedonian king faced the ultimate power of the ancient world. Alexander the Great, having already consolidated Greece, marched east to confront the vast Persian Achaemenid Empire under King Darius III. Darius chose the battlefield carefully, a wide, flat plain perfect for his greatest assets, scythed chariots to break enemy lines, and a numerically superior force that some ancient sources claim numbered over 1 million men. The Persian king even had the ground cleared and leveled to ensure his chariots could operate at maximum effectiveness, demonstrating a level of strategic forethought that matched his resources. It was a battle that pitted the established, monolithic power of Persia against the dynamic, innovative tactics of the Macedonian phalanx. The strategic genius of Alexander was on full display at Gaugamela, a masterclass in tactics that still fascinates military historians today. Instead of meeting the Persian center head-on, Alexander executed a brilliant oblique advance with his right flank, leading his elite companion cavalry at an angle that drew the Persian cavalry and elite units out of position. This created a gap in the Persian line, which Alexander exploited with a sudden, devastating charge aimed directly at Darius himself. Seeing their king in peril and his personal guard wavering, the Persian center broke and fled, triggering a complete collapse and a rout despite the advantage in numbers. The battle ended the Achaemenid Empire, a dynasty that had ruled for over 200 years, and ushered in the Hellenistic Age. Alexander's victory led to the spread of Greek language, culture, and art across the Near East, fundamentally altering the course of Western civilization and founding cities like Alexandria in Egypt that would become centers of learning for centuries. In the year 1066, the fate of England was decided on a hill near the town of Hastings, an event that would profoundly and permanently alter the nation's identity. Following the death of the childless King Edward the Confessor, two powerful claimants vied for the throne. Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, crowned king in England, and William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed a promise of the throne and distant blood ties. William assembled a fleet and an army of Norman, French, and Breton knights, crossing the English Channel and landing on the south coast. Harold, having just marched his army south after defeating a Norwegian invasion in the north, took up a defensive position on Senlac Hill, forming a formidable shield wall of his housecarls and furred militia. The stage was set for a collision of two cultures, the Anglo-Saxon and the Norman French. The Battle of Hastings raged for an entire day, a brutal attritional struggle where the English shield wall initially repelled repeated Norman cavalry charges. According to the near-contemporary Bayeux Tapestry, a unique 70-meter-long embroidered chronicle of the event, the Normans employed a crucial feigned retreat tactic. They pretended to flee in panic, luring elements of the English army, who broke formation to pursue, down the hill before turning and annihilating them in the open. This, combined with the Norman archers' effectiveness, gradually wore down the English defenses. The decisive moment came late in the day, as chroniclers record, when King Harold was killed. His death, immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry, though the exact manner remains a subject of historical debate, shattered the morale of the Anglo-Saxons, and their army finally broke and fled. William's victory began the Norman conquest, leading to the replacement of the English aristocracy with Norman nobles, the introduction of the French language into the English lexicon, and the construction of countless stone castles to secure his new kingdom. More than 700 years later, on a muddy field in Belgium, the final chapter of an epic European saga was written at the Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815. This was the climactic confrontation involving Napoleon Bonaparte, who had escaped from his exile on the island of Elba just months earlier to begin his last bid for power, known as the 100 Days. Articled against him was the Seventh Coalition, a massive multinational force, but Napoleon's primary goal was to defeat the armies led by the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian Field Marshal Blücher before they could combine. Napoleon's strategy was to strike quickly and separately, a technique that had served him well throughout his career, but his army was not the battle-hardened force of his earlier campaigns. The weather was also a curse. Torrential rain the night before turned the battlefield into a quagmire, delaying his attack and blunting the effectiveness of his artillery. For hours, Wellington's Anglo-Allied army, positioned on a ridge, withstood wave after wave of French assaults against key points like the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte. The battle reached its dramatic climax when Napoleon committed his finest troops, the undefeated Imperial Guard, in a last-ditch effort to break the Allied center. They advanced in perfect formation, but were met with a devastating volley of musket fire from Wellington's hidden troops, who rose from the reverse slope of the ridge and unleashed a withering counterattack. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard broke, and as the word "squot" spread through the French lines, the entire army began to disintegrate. At this critical moment, the Prussian army, having marched relentlessly from the Battle of Ligny 2 days earlier, arrived on the battlefield and crashed into Napoleon's right flank, turning a defeat into a total rout. The Battle of Waterloo ended 23 years of almost continuous warfare in Europe, ended Napoleon's rule, and led to the Congress of Vienna, which redrew the map of the continent and established a balance of power that would maintain relative peace in Europe for nearly a century. The 19th century, forged in the crucible of Waterloo's cannon fire, gave way to an age of unprecedented industrial ambition, where humanity sought to conquer nature through iron, steam, and colossal engineering. This new era of technological marvels, however, brought with it a new kind of catastrophe, born not of war, but of human hubris and flawed design. The very machines and structures built to showcase mankind's ingenuity would, in moments of terrifying failure, become monuments to its vulnerability. From the depths of the oceans to the spans of great rivers, these disasters would capture the world's attention, rewrite safety regulations, and serve as eternal cautionary tales. They are stark reminders that progress without prudence can lead to the most shocking of outcomes. Our journey into this realm of engineering hubris begins not in the age of steam, but 2 centuries earlier, in the Stockholm harbor of the year 1628. King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, a dominant military power during the 30 Years' War, demanded a warship of unparalleled power and prestige to lead his fleet. The result was the Vasa, a gilded and heavily armed behemoth designed to be the most formidable warship in the Baltic. It was a floating symbol of Swedish imperial might, adorned with hundreds of ornate sculptures intended to inspire fear and awe in enemy forces. On August 10, 1628, the Vasa set sail on its maiden voyage before a crowd of thousands, a spectacle of national pride that would soon turn to disbelief. Modern naval architects who have studied the Vasa have pinpointed a clear and catastrophic design flaw. The ship was simply top-heavy and dangerously unstable. Armed with 64 bronze cannons arranged on 2 towering gun decks, its center of gravity was far too high for its narrow hull, a problem exacerbated by the king's last-minute addition of a second heavy gun deck. Contemporary records suggest that the ship's builders, during stability tests, knew the vessel was perilously close to capsizing, but they were powerless to object to the monarch's demands. According to some surviving documents, the ship's captain allegedly demonstrated the instability to the admiral by having 30 men run from one side of the deck to the other, causing it to rock alarmingly. These warnings, however, were ignored in the face of political pressure and impending war. Less than a nautical mile from the shore, a sudden, strong gust of wind filled the Vasa's sails, and the great ship heeled violently to one side. As it listed, seawater surged into the open lower gun ports, which had been left open for a salute, and the ship began to take on water at an incredible rate. Within minutes, the pride of the Swedish Navy sank to the bottom of the harbor, taking with it an estimated 30 of the 150 people aboard. The disaster was a profound national embarrassment and a stunning failure, an event so shocking that an inquest was immediately held to find a scapegoat. No single person was ultimately punished, as the blame was spread among the shipbuilder, the captain, and the military officials who had approved the unstable design. For over 300 years, the Vasa lay preserved in the cold, brackish waters of Stockholm harbor, a forgotten time capsule of the 17th century. Its rediscovery in 1956 and its subsequent salvage in 1961 stands as one of the greatest achievements in maritime archaeology. Today, the almost perfectly preserved ship is the centerpiece of the Vasa Museum in Stockholm, visited by millions each year. It serves as a unique and tangible lesson in the fundamental principles of engineering, a hauntingly beautiful relic that speaks directly across the centuries about the perils of ambition overriding physics. The Vasa is not just a shipwreck, it is a frozen moment of failure that has taught generations of engineers the absolute necessity of stability and sound design principles. Fast forward to the dawn of the 20th century, an era defined by a new gilded age of technological confidence and opulence, epitomized by the creation of the largest moving object ever built by man. In the shipyards of Belfast, Ireland, the White Star Line constructed the RMS Titanic, a luxury liner that was marketed not just as a ship, but as a symbol of human triumph over nature. At 882 feet long and displacing over 52,000 tons, it was a marvel of modern engineering, fitted with every conceivable luxury, from Turkish baths to a Parisian-style cafe. Its sheer scale and advanced design led the popular press of the time to declare it unsinkable, a claim that would tragically fuel the hubris surrounding its voyage. The Titanic was the embodiment of its age's belief in progress, a floating palace destined to link the old world and the new with unparalleled speed and style. Beneath its lavish veneer, the Titanic incorporated state-of-the-art safety features, chief among them its 16 watertight compartments, which could be sealed off from the bridge by electrically operated doors. It was widely believed that the ship could stay afloat even with 4 of these compartments flooded, a fact that led to the decision to equip it with lifeboats for only about half the people on board, as the boats were intended for ferrying passengers to other ships, not for a full-scale evacuation. This critical architectural oversight, however, held a hidden fatal flaw. The watertight bulkheads did not extend all the way to the upper deck, but were sealed only about 10 feet above the waterline. This meant that if enough compartments were breached at the bow, water would simply spill over the tops of the bulkheads from one compartment to the next, dooming the ship in a scenario its designers had not fully anticipated. On the night of April 14, 1912, 4 days into its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, the Titanic was steaming at nearly 22 knots through a region of the North Atlantic known for its icebergs. Throughout the day, the ship's wireless operators had received multiple ice warnings from other vessels, but some of these messages never reached the bridge, and the ship's speed was not reduced. At 11:40 p.m., lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee in the Crow's Nest suddenly spotted an iceberg directly ahead, ringing the bridge bell 3 times and telephoning the warning. First Officer William Murdoch ordered the ship hard a starboard in an attempt to port around the obstacle, while the engines were ordered to full astern, but it was too late to avoid a collision. The Titanic grazed the iceberg along its starboard side, causing a series of small but fatal gashes and popped rivets below the waterline. For the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, the drama of the century unfolded as the unsinkable ship slowly but inexorably succumbed to the sea. The initial impact had flooded the first 5 of the 16 watertight compartments, a damage pattern beyond any possible scenario the ship's designers had imagined. As the bow filled with water and sank deeper, the ship's stern rose out of the water, creating immense stress on the vessel's structure and causing catastrophic failures as the midsection began to break apart. Water, as engineers had not fully considered, spilled over the tops of the watertight bulkheads from one compartment to the next, sealing the ship's fate. The lifeboats, many launched half-empty, were lowered into the freezing Atlantic in a scene of chaos, bravery, and immense social stratification, where a passenger's class largely dictated their chances of survival. The human cost of the disaster was staggering, with over 1,500 people losing their lives in the icy water, many of them third-class passengers and crew who were trapped below decks or had little access to the lifeboats. The world was horrified by the news, and the sinking of the Titanic became a global media sensation, prompting an immediate and sweeping re-evaluation of maritime safety. In the wake of the tragedy, the British government held the Wreck Commissioner's inquiry, while the United States Senate launched its own investigation, both of which led to sweeping reforms. The most significant outcome was the First International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, in 1914, which mandated new regulations for lifeboat capacity, radio communications, and the creation of the International Ice Patrol. The Titanic's greatest legacy was not its luxury, but the profound and lasting changes it forced upon global maritime law, a direct and world-changing consequence of its catastrophic failure. While the sea claimed its toll of technological hubris, the land itself also witnessed dramatic failures of engineering, none more visually spectacular than the collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington state on November 7, 1940. As the United States emerged from the Great Depression, massive public works projects like this suspension bridge were seen as symbols of progress and economic revival. Connecting the Tacoma Narrows, the bridge was celebrated for its slender, elegant design, which used solid plate girders to support the roadway instead of the traditional and more expensive open lattice trusses. This streamlined, modern aesthetic, however, created a structure that was fundamentally susceptible to aerodynamic forces, a fact that would soon become terrifyingly apparent to the local residents. From its opening in July 1940, the bridge began to exhibit strange behavior, earning it the nickname Galloping Gertie. Even in mild winds, the roadway would begin to ripple and oscillate vertically, with wave-like motions that could be seen and felt by drivers. The bridge's unique ability to undulate made it a local tourist attraction, as people would drive from miles around to experience the eerie sensation of crossing a moving bridge. Engineers attempted to remedy the issue by installing hydraulic dampers and tie-down cables connected to large concrete blocks in the water below, but these measures proved ineffective against the persistent vibrations. The underlying problem was a phenomenon little understood at the time: aeroelastic flutter, a potentially destructive self-feeding vibration where aerodynamic forces exerted by the wind on the structure couple with its natural bending and twisting modes. The solid girders acted like an airfoil, capturing the wind and generating lift, which in turn amplified the bridge's movements, creating a vicious cycle. On the morning of its collapse, a steady wind of approximately 42 miles per hour was blowing through the Narrows, a wind speed that was not considered dangerous. The bridge began its familiar vertical oscillations, but soon these gave way to a new, violent twisting motion, known as torsional oscillation, where the roadway alternately rose and fell on opposite sides, twisting at angles of up to 45 degrees. For over an hour, the bridge endured this agonizing contortion, with engineers and journalists watching in disbelief as the center span twisted and buckled. Finally, at 11 a.m., the central suspension cables snapped, and a 600-foot section of the concrete roadway broke free and plunged 190 feet into the waters of Puget Sound below. The entire event was captured on film, providing engineers with invaluable, if horrifying, data, and creating one of the most iconic images of engineering failure in history. The collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge had an immediate and profound impact on the field of civil and aeronautical engineering, forcing a complete re-evaluation of suspension bridge design. The investigation, led by engineer Farquharson and aided by aerodynamicist Theodore von Karman, confirmed that aeroelastic flutter was the primary cause of the failure, a concept that was then applied to the design of aircraft wings. The disaster proved that wind could not be treated as a static force, but had to be understood as a dynamic and complex phenomenon. Modern suspension bridges, from the Verrazano Narrows in New York to the Akashi Kaikyo in Japan, are now built with wide, open trusses and aerodynamically shaped roadways that allow wind to pass through them, effectively eliminating the conditions that could lead to another galloping Gertie. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge was a catastrophic failure, but it taught the world a lesson that ultimately made all future bridges safer. As the 20th century progressed, the scale and potential danger of engineering projects grew exponentially, culminating in the harnessing of the atom, a power that promised limitless energy but carried the risk of unparalleled devastation. In the Soviet Union, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located near the city of Pripyat in what is now Ukraine, was seen as a triumph of communist science and industry, a symbol of a bright, nuclear-powered future. Its 4 RBMK-1000 reactors were a unique Soviet design, high-power channel-type reactors that were also used to produce plutonium for the military. The very design of these reactors, however, harbored a grave and dangerous secret, a fatal flaw that Soviet officials were aware of but had deliberately concealed from both the international community and many of their own operators. This secrecy and a culture of prioritizing production over safety created a ticking time bomb. The critical flaw within the RBMK reactor was its positive void coefficient, a dangerous characteristic where an increase in steam bubbles or voids in the reactor's cooling water would cause an increase in its reactivity and thus its power output. In most Western reactor designs, an increase in steam causes a decrease in power, acting as a natural safety brake. But in the RBMK, it acted as an accelerator. On April 26, 1986, the night shift at reactor number 4 was tasked with conducting a poorly planned safety test to see if the turbine could power the cooling water pumps in the event of a power outage. In a series of fateful decisions, operators disabled automatic shutdown systems and withdrew an excessive number of control rods from the core, pushing the reactor into an extremely unstable and low-power state, from which it was difficult to recover. The operators had bypassed nearly every safety protocol in a desperate attempt to complete the test. At 1:23 a.m., the operators initiated the test, and as the water pump slowed, steam began to build in the core. Due to the positive void coefficient, the reactor's power began to skyrocket uncontrollably, and the operators, realizing the catastrophic danger, pressed the AZ5 emergency shutdown button to insert all the control rods back into the core. Tragically, This final action was the ultimate trigger for disaster. The control rods were tipped with graphite, which for the first few seconds of insertion actually sped up the reaction in the lower part of the core before the neutron-absorbing material could take effect. This design flaw caused a massive, instantaneous power surge, which led to a series of powerful steam explosions that blew the 2,000-ton lid off the reactor, completely destroying the reactor building and ejecting radioactive material into the atmosphere. It was a nuclear explosion of a scale never before seen, a man-made catastrophe of the highest order. The immediate aftermath was a scene of apocalyptic horror, as the graphite core of the reactor was exposed to the air and ignited, sending a plume of highly radioactive smoke and debris miles into the sky. Firefighters arrived within minutes to battle the blaze, completely unaware of the deadly radiation levels, and most of them would die of acute radiation sickness within weeks. The Soviet leadership, caught in a state of denial, delayed the evacuation of the nearby city of Pripyat for 36 hours, exposing its 50,000 residents to dangerous levels of radiation. The radioactive cloud released from Chernobyl drifted over vast swaths of Europe, contaminating land and food supplies from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. The long-term consequences, including a massive increase in thyroid cancer rates and the creation of a vast, uninhabitable exclusion zone, continue to this day, making Chernobyl the most infamous and costly engineering disaster in human history. The catastrophic failure at Chernobyl represented more than an engineering disaster. It was a profound moral and political crisis that laid bare the deep-seated rot within the Soviet system. This event, occurring in a state built on a foundation of lies and technological hubris, became a powerful symbol of systemic decay, accelerating a loss of faith that was already spreading across the Eastern Bloc. Historians now argue that the disaster's cover-up and the state's clumsy reaction irreparably damaged the legitimacy of the communist ideology, not just in the USSR, but among its satellite states as well. When people could no longer trust the government to tell the truth about the very air they breathed, the authority of that government began to evaporate. This erosion of belief would prove to be a more powerful explosive force than any bomb, setting the stage for the revolutionary convulsions that would soon reshape the world map. In the heart of a divided Europe, another symbol of systemic fracture stood for nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall, a grim concrete scar that physically and ideologically separated the free West from the communist East. Erected in 1961 by the German Democratic Republic, the wall was officially called the Anti-Fascist Protection Rampart, but in reality, it was a prison wall designed to stop the mass exodus of its own citizens seeking freedom and economic opportunity. For 28 years, it stood as the most potent physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain, a backdrop of tension, espionage, and tragedy where over 100 people died trying to cross it. Yet, by the late 1980s, the wall was no longer an impermeable barrier, but a fragile anachronism, held in place only by the threat of Soviet military intervention. With that intervention becoming increasingly unlikely due to the USSR's internal crises and the reformist policies of Mikhail Gorbachev, the pressure for change became irresistible. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1989, a tide of dissent was rising across East Germany, fueled by economic stagnation, political repression, and the inspiring sight of reform in neighboring Poland and Hungary. The Quote 15 in Leipzig began with just a few hundred protesters, but quickly grew into massive, peaceful rallies, with hundreds of thousands of citizens chanting Quote 16. The East German government, led by the hardline Erich Honecker, seemed paralyzed, unable to comprehend the scale of the popular uprising, or to formulate a coherent response beyond promises of reform that no one believed. The floodgates were burst open when Hungary, seeking a closer relationship with the West, dismantled its border fence with Austria, creating a hole in the Iron Curtain through which thousands of East Germans escaped on 17. The exodus of its people, coupled with the ever-growing street protests, pushed the GDR regime to the brink of collapse. Then, on the evening of November 9th, a moment of bureaucratic clumsiness ignited a historical firestorm. At a live press conference, East German official Günter Schabowski was handed a note about new, relaxed travel regulations, which he had not had time to read properly. When a journalist asked when the new rules would take effect, a flustered Schabowski shuffled his papers and improvised, quote, 18. Within minutes, quote, his words were being broadcast on West German television, and East Berliners, in a state of disbelief and excitement, began gathering at the border crossings in small groups. They came to test the announcement, to see if it was true, and what they did set off an unstoppable chain reaction. The overwhelmed and confused border guards, receiving no orders from their superiors, eventually capitulated and the gates were opened, unleashing a torrent of euphoric humanity through the wall in one of the most spontaneous and joyous celebrations in modern history. While the German Democratic Republic dissolved in a wave of euphoria, another Eastern Bloc nation, Romania, was convulsed by a violent and bloody revolution that would claim thousands of lives. For 24 years, Romania had been ruled by Nicolae Ceausescu, a megalomaniacal dictator who, along with his wife Elena, had created a cult of personality so pervasive and a regime so repressive that it stood out even among its Soviet-aligned peers. The Securitate, his feared secret police, monitored every aspect of public and private life, while the Romanian people suffered from acute food shortages, a failing economy, and the bizarre oppression of a systematization program that demolished historic villages to make way for grandiose yet empty architectural projects. Unlike in other Eastern European countries, the opposition in Romania was utterly crushed, leaving no organized structure for dissent to emerge. The revolt, when it came, was not a planned event, but a sudden, primal explosion of long-suppressed rage. The revolt began not in the capital, but in the western city of Timișoara, when the government attempted to evict a dissident Hungarian Reformed pastor, Laszlo Tokes. The initial small gathering of parishioners to protect their pastor quickly swelled as locals, enraged by years of tyranny and deprivation, joined the protest, chanting anti-government slogans for the first time in decades. The security forces responded with brutal force, firing on the unarmed crowd, an act which, instead of quelling the unrest, turned a local protest into a national uprising. News of the massacre in Timișoara, despite the government's attempt to impose a media blackout, spread through the country via Radio Free Europe and word of mouth. The spark had been lit, and now the fire of revolution was leaping from city to city, drawing in students, workers, and ordinary citizens who finally felt that the terror of the regime could be challenged. The rebellion swiftly spread to Bucharest, where on December 21st, Nicolae Ceausescu attempted to address a mass crowd from the balcony of the Central Committee building, expecting the usual staged applause and chants of support. But this time, the atmosphere was different, charged with a palpable and hostile energy that the dictator and his wife seemed utterly unable to perceive. When he began to speak, a few boos and jeers rippled through the square, and within moments, the entire crowd erupted in a deafening roar of anger, a sound that no leader could ignore. The live television broadcast showed the dictator's face, a mask of shock and disbelief, as he realized he had lost all control. The broadcast was abruptly cut off, but it was too late. The image of the seemingly invincible leader being publicly humiliated was seared into the national consciousness, signaling that his reign was over. Within days, the dictator and his wife were captured, subjected to a brief, secret military trial on charges of genocide and undermining the national economy, and executed by firing squad on Christmas Day. The footage of their hasty trial and execution was broadcast across the country, a shocking and definitive end to a brutal dynasty that left the Romanian people both liberated and deeply traumatized. The revolution's aftermath was chaotic, with former Securitate members and unknown terrorists clashing with the new provisional government in a violent power struggle that continued for weeks. Analysts to this day debate the full extent to which the uprising was a spontaneous popular revolt or one partially hijacked by elements within the Communist Party itself. What remains undisputed is that the Romanian Revolution was the most violent overthrow of a communist government in Eastern Europe, a raw and desperate fight for freedom that cost the lives of over 1,000 people. 2 decades later, the nature of political revolt was being reshaped by a new and powerful force: the digital network, which could connect and mobilize populations with a speed that was previously unimaginable. The Arab Spring, a series of pro-democracy uprisings that swept across the Middle East and North Africa beginning in 2010, was largely coordinated through social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter. This was not a rebellion sparked by a singular political party or ideology, but a leaderless movement of a generation, often young and educated, who faced a future of high unemployment, political corruption, and the suffocating grip of long-standing autocratic rulers. The internet provided the tools to bypass state-controlled media, share information about human rights abuses, and organize protests on a massive scale, turning individual frustrations into a collective roar for change. The old methods of state control were suddenly facing an enemy that was decentralized, agile, and wired. The Arab Spring was ignited by a single, desperate act in a small Tunisian town on December 17, 2010. Mohamed Bouazizi, a 26-year-old street vendor, had his vegetable cart confiscated by a municipal inspector who publicly humiliated him, an act that was the final straw in a life filled with frustration and economic hardship. In an act of ultimate protest that would shock the world, he doused himself in paint thinner and set himself on fire in front of the governor's office. Bouazizi's self-immolation was not a political statement in the traditional sense, but it resonated with a profound sense of injustice and despair felt by millions across the region. His death a few days later sparked massive protests in his hometown of Sidi Bouzid, which rapidly grew and spread to the capital, Tunis, fueled by videos and accounts shared online. The sheer scale of the uprising forced Tunisia's longtime president, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, to flee the country in January. Bouazizi's act resonated across a region seething with similar grievances, igniting a domino effect of protests that challenged the established order in nation after nation. In Egypt, millions gathered in Cairo's Tahrir Square, occupying the public space for 18 days in a peaceful but determined standoff that ultimately ended the 30-year reign of President Hosni Mubarak. In Libya, the protest descended into a full-blown civil war, aided by a NATO intervention, which culminated in the brutal capture and killing of the dictator Muammar Gaddafi after 42 years in power. The wave of hope also washed over Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain, where people took to the streets demanding dignity, freedom, and an end to corruption, inspired by the successes in Tunisia and Egypt. For a brief moment, it seemed as though a new democratic dawn was breaking across the Arab world, a testament to the power of a connected populace to demand change. However, the Arab Spring demonstrated with brutal clarity that the path from protest to stable democracy is neither straight nor guaranteed, often leading to outcomes more tragic than the initial oppression. While Tunisia managed a difficult but ultimately successful transition to a democratic system, other nations were not so fortunate. Egypt experienced a brief democratic interlude before a military coup returned a more repressive government to power in 2013. Libya fractured into warring factions, plunging the country into a decade of chaos and civil war. Most devastatingly, in Syria, the protests were met with extreme military force by the Assad regime, sparking a catastrophic and ongoing civil war that has killed hundreds of thousands, created millions of refugees, and drawn in global powers. The initial promise of the Arab Spring gave way to a complex and often tragic reality, raising difficult questions about the viability of revolution in the face of deeply entrenched power structures and sectarian divisions. In the post-Soviet space, the struggle between democratic aspirations and authoritarian legacy continued to play out dramatically, nowhere more so than in Ukraine, a nation perpetually caught between the influence of Moscow and the West. Having already experienced one peaceful uprising, the Orange Revolution in 2004, Ukrainians once again found themselves at a crossroads in the winter of 2013 and 2014. The country was led by President Viktor Yanukovych, a figure whose presidency was marked by widespread corruption, a growing closeness to Russia, and the imprisonment of his main political rival, Yulia Tymoshenko. The Ukrainian people, particularly the youth, looked westward to the European Union, seeing membership as a path to economic prosperity, rule of law, and a definitive break from the corrupt post-Soviet model. A deep cultural and political chasm was widening within the country, a schism that would soon erupt into a revolutionary confrontation. The spark for the Ukrainian Revolution, known as the Euromaidan, was a geopolitical decision made on November 21, 2013, when Yanukovych's government abruptly suspended preparations for a long-awaited association agreement with the European Union. The move, widely seen as a capitulation to pressure from Russian President Vladimir Putin, was met with shock and anger by pro-European Ukrainians. That same evening, a small group of journalists and activists, led by Mustafa Naim, posted on Facebook a simple call to action. "Come to the Independence Square if you want to see the agreement signed." A few hundred people gathered that cold night, expecting a simple protest, but they stayed, and their numbers grew in the following days. What began as a pro-European student protest swelled into a massive, all-encompassing movement on Kyiv's Independence Square, or Maidan Nezalezhnosti, transforming the square into a sprawling, self-governing tent city of protest. The government's response was dismissive and then brutally repressive, a miscalculation that only served to galvanize the opposition. In late November, riot police violently dispersed a small group of student protesters, an act of violence that shocked the nation and brought tens of thousands of ordinary citizens onto the streets in a wave of outrage. The movement's demands evolved from a simple call to sign the EU agreement to a broader demand for democratic reforms, an end to corruption, and the resignation of the Yanukovych government. The Maidan became a microcosm of a new Ukrainian civil society, with its own makeshift hospitals, kitchens, and media centers, all protected by barricades built from snow, wood, and scrap metal. For 3 months, a tense standoff ensued, punctuated by massive peaceful demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people, a testament to the population's resolve. The final days of February 2014 saw the most violent clashes, resulting in dozens of deaths and ultimately the flight of President Yanukovych after he abandoned his opulent palace and fled to Russia. The revolution, which came to be known as the Revolution of Dignity, was a victory for the protesters, but it triggered a chain of events with devastating consequences. Russia, viewing the ouster of its ally as a Western-backed coup, swiftly annexed the Crimean Peninsula and fomented a separatist war in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. The uprising on the Maidan, a moment of immense national pride and unity for many Ukrainians, simultaneously plunged the country into a conflict that would redefine its identity and place in the world for generations to come. The events in Ukraine serve as a stark reminder that revolutionary victories are often just the beginning of a much longer and more perilous struggle for a nation's soul. While revolutions on the streets reshape nations, other revolutions, quieter but no less profound, erupt in the laboratories and studies of brilliant minds, fundamentally altering humanity's perception of reality itself. These intellectual earthquakes often begin as heretical ideas, challenged by the established dogma of their time, before eventually becoming the bedrock of modern understanding. They are the pivotal moments when a single observation or a sudden flash of insight propels the entire human story onto a new trajectory. This chapter chronicles those seismic shifts in knowledge, the inventions and discoveries that did not just add to our collective wisdom, but completely rewrote its very foundation. From the cosmos to the cell, from the printed page to the fabric of space-time, these are the events that defined our scientific age. The first great scientific revolution to challenge the very foundation of human thought began not with a bang, but with a complex mathematical model in the 16th century. For over a millennium, the Western world, guided by the teachings of Ptolemy and the authority of the Church, accepted the geocentric model, a stationary Earth at the center of a perfect celestial universe. Then, a Polish astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus, working in quiet solitude, developed a radically different and far more elegant explanation. His groundbreaking book, De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, published in the year of his death, 1543, proposed that the Earth and other planets revolved around the Sun. This heliocentric model was not merely an astronomical adjustment. It was a philosophical bombshell that displaced humanity from the center of creation, initiating a crisis of faith and reason that would reverberate for centuries. Copernicus had provided the theory, but it required physical evidence to overturn a worldview, evidence that would arrive a generation later thanks to an Italian polymath named Galileo Galilei. After hearing of a new Dutch invention, the spyglass, Galileo constructed his own far more powerful telescope and turned it toward the heavens in 1609. What he saw was staggering and utterly heretical. Mountains and craters on the supposedly perfect moon, 4 moons orbiting Jupiter, and a full set of phases for the planet Venus. These observations directly contradicted the Ptolemaic model, proving that not everything orbited the Earth, and that celestial bodies were not perfect, incorruptible spheres. When Galileo published his findings and vocally defended the Copernican system, he was famously tried by the Inquisition, forced to recant, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest, a martyr to the empirical method of scientific inquiry. As our understanding of the cosmos was being shattered and rebuilt, another revolution, this time in the dissemination of information itself, was taking place in a German city. Around the year 1440, in Mainz, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg combined existing technologies into a single, world-altering invention: the printing press with movable metal type. Prior to this, books were rare, priceless artifacts, painstakingly copied by hand by scribes, a process that was slow, expensive, and prone to error. Gutenberg's press allowed for the rapid, accurate, and relatively cheap mass production of texts, a capability that was immediately recognized as revolutionary. The first major book he printed was the Gutenberg Bible, but the true power of his invention lay in its ability to spread new ideas, from Martin Luther's 95 Theses that fueled the Protestant Reformation, to the scientific treatises that enabled the Enlightenment, effectively democratizing knowledge and ending the monopoly on literacy held by the clergy and the aristocracy. Centuries later, another set of voyage-based observations would ignite a revolution in the biological sciences, one that struck at the heart of what it means to be human. In the 1830s, a young naturalist named Charles Darwin spent 5 years circumnavigating the globe aboard HMS Beagle, meticulously collecting specimens and recording data. His most critical observations came from the Galapagos Islands, where he noted that unique species of finches and tortoises varied from island to island, each perfectly adapted to its specific environment. This puzzle led him, after decades of thought and experimentation, to a powerful and controversial theory outlined in his 1859 masterpiece, On the Origin of Species. Darwin proposed that all life, including humanity, evolved over immense spans of time through a process he called natural selection, a mechanism of variation and struggle that did not require divine intervention. This theory of evolution provided the unifying principle for all of biology, explaining the diversity and interconnectedness of life on Earth in a way that was both elegant and deeply unsettling to Victorian society. If Darwin described the how of life's evolution, the discovery of its fundamental molecular code would be the 20th century's crowning achievement. In the early 1950s, at the University of Cambridge, a race was on to determine the structure of deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, the molecule suspected to carry hereditary information. 2 young scientists, American James Watson and Briton Francis Crick, were building theoretical models, while at King's College London, a brilliant X-ray crystallographer named Rosalind Franklin was generating critical experimental data. Her photograph, known as '23, provided the clearest image yet of the molecule's form, revealing a helical structure. Without Franklin's full knowledge, Watson and Crick were shown this data, which was the final piece they needed to deduce DNA's iconic double helix structure in 1953. A discovery that unveiled the very language of life and opened the door to the modern fields of genetics and biotechnology. Not all great discoveries come from methodical research. Some are born from pure, unadulterated serendipity, the fortunate accident witnessed by a prepared mind. In September of 1928, Scottish scientist Alexander Fleming returned from a holiday to his laboratory in St. Mary's Hospital, London, to find a clutter of petri dishes he had left out. Before discarding them, he noticed something peculiar on one dish, where a culture of Staphylococcus bacteria was growing. A mold, later identified as Penicillium notatum, had contaminated the plate, and around the mold, the bacteria had been destroyed. Fleming correctly hypothesized that the mold was producing a substance that was lethal to bacteria, a substance he named penicillin. Though he could not isolate the active compound in a stable form, his discovery paved the way for a team at Oxford University, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, to develop it into the world's first mass-produced antibiotic, a drug that would save millions of lives and usher in the age of modern medicine. As the 20th century progressed, our perception of reality itself was once again dismantled and reassembled by a physicist working as a patent clerk in Bern, Switzerland. In 1905, Albert Einstein published a series of papers that would become known as his miracle year, including his special theory of relativity, which proposed that the speed of light is constant and that space and time are relative to the observer. This theory produced the most famous equation in history, E equals mc squared, which demonstrated that mass and energy are two sides of the same coin, a principle that would ultimately explain the power of the stars and the atom bomb. A decade later, he expanded his ideas into the general theory of relativity, a revolutionary conception of gravity not as a force, but as a curvature of the four-dimensional fabric of space-time caused by mass and energy. This mind-bending theory was confirmed in 1919 during a solar eclipse, when astronomers observed starlight being bent by the sun's gravity, turning Einstein into an international icon and forever changing our understanding of the universe. While scientists like Einstein were redrawing the map of the cosmos, a different kind of revolution was already centuries underway, one that redraw the map of the Earth itself. This was the age of exploration, an era driven by a potent mix of ambition, greed, faith, and insatiable curiosity, which saw humanity push beyond the horizons of the known world. Long before Columbus or da Gama set sail, however, another seafaring culture had already achieved a staggering transatlantic feat. Around the year 1000, a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, who had settled Greenland, led an expedition west from Greenland. According to Norse sagas, he discovered a land he called, quote, 25, quote, for its wild grapes, a land historians now believe was the coast of North America. For centuries, these sagas were considered mere myth, a romantic fantasy of a warrior culture. But that perception was dramatically altered in the 1960s. At a site called Lonceau Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada, archaeologists unearthed the incontrovertible proof, the remains of 8 Norse-style timber buildings and artifacts unmistakably of Viking origin. Carbon dating placed the settlement at circa 1000 AD, perfectly matching the timeline of the sagas and confirming Ericsson's voyage as the first documented European arrival in the New World, nearly 500 years before Columbus. The mystery remains, however, as to why this monumental discovery did not lead to permanent Norse colonization and was ultimately lost to history. The true explosion of global exploration, however, would begin in the 15th century on the Iberian Peninsula, spearheaded by the Kingdom of Portugal. At the heart of this Portuguese ambition was Prince Henry the Navigator, a royal prince who, though he never sailed on an exploratory voyage himself, sponsored and organized hundreds of them. Establishing a center for navigational and cartographic studies at Sagres, he brought together the best mapmakers, shipbuilders, and astronomers to perfect the art of long-distance sea travel. Their primary goal was to find a direct sea route to the legendary spice markets of Asia, particularly India, which would allow them to bypass the Muslim and Venetian merchants who controlled the overland trade routes. This led to a methodical process of creeping down the coast of Africa, with each voyage venturing a little further than the last. The breakthrough came in 1488, when Bartholomew Diaz and his crew became the first Europeans to round the southern tip of Africa, which he fittingly named the Cape of Storms, later renamed the Cape of Good Hope by the king for its promise of a route to the east. Having proven the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected, the stage was set for the final push to India, a task entrusted to the formidable and often brutal explorer Vasco da Gama. In 1497, da Gama set sail from Lisbon with a fleet of 4 ships, embarking on a voyage of over 24,000 kilometers that would forever alter the balance of global power. Unlike the relatively calm coastal hops of his predecessors, he undertook a perilous open ocean journey, swinging far out into the South Atlantic to catch the favorable winds that would carry him around the Cape of Good Hope. The passage was horrific. His crew was decimated by scurvy, a disease whose cause was then unknown, and they faced hostility from Arab traders who had long dominated the Indian Ocean trade. Despite these immense hardships, he reached Calicut, India, in May of 1498, where he filled his ships with spices to the point of being dangerously overloaded. The return voyage was equally nightmarish, but when da Gama finally limped back to Lisbon in 1499 with a cargo of pepper and ginger worth 60 times the cost of the expedition, the economic and geopolitical ramifications were immediate and profound, launching the Portuguese Empire and a century of European dominance in Asia. While the Portuguese were pioneering the eastern route to Asia, a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus was pitching a radical alternative to the Spanish monarchy, a westward route. Columbus, operating on a significant underestimate of the Earth's circumference, believed he could reach the East Indies by sailing directly across the Atlantic, a proposal that had been rejected by Portugal. After years of lobbying, he finally secured the support of Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand II of Spain, embarking on his first voyage in August of 1492 with 3 small ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After a grueling 2-month journey, on October 12th of that year, a lookout on the Pinta sighted land, an island in the present-day Bahamas that Columbus named San Salvador. Convinced he had reached the outskirts of the Asian continent, he called the native people Indios, a name that would stick, and he would die still believing he had accomplished his goal, never realizing the true nature and scale of his discovery. Columbus's 4 voyages initiated permanent European contact with the Americas and triggered what historians now call the Columbian Exchange, the widespread transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technology, diseases, and ideas between the Americas, West Africa, and the Old World. A transfer that reshaped the ecological and demographic landscape of the entire planet. Perhaps the most audacious and consequential voyage of the entire age was the expedition led by Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator sailing for the Spanish crown. Magellan's objective was to reach the Spice Islands, or the Moluccas, by sailing west, a feat that, if successful, would prove they lay in the Spanish sphere of influence as defined by the Treaty of Tordesillas. In September of 1519, he set sail with a fleet of 5 ships and 270 men, facing mutiny, starvation, and the unknown vastness of the Pacific Ocean. After navigating the treacherous, labyrinthine passage at the southern tip of South America, now known as the Strait of Magellan, his fleet emerged into an ocean so calm and peaceful he named it the Pacific. This ocean, however, was far from peaceful. The crossing across its immense, uncharted expanse took 98 days, during which the crew ran out of fresh food and were forced to survive on leather, sawdust, and rats, leading to the deaths of dozens of men from scurvy. Magellan himself would not complete the journey. He was killed in a battle with a local chieftain in the Philippines, but a single remaining ship, the Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastián Elcano, limped back to Spain in September of 1522. The Victoria's arrival marked the completion of the first circumnavigation of the Earth, a monumental achievement that provided concrete empirical proof that the world was round and gave humanity its first true understanding of its staggering scale. The legacy of these initial voyages inspired centuries of further exploration, cartography, and, inevitably, exploitation. In the late 16th century, English seaman Sir Francis Drake became the second commander to successfully circumnavigate the globe, though his voyage was as much an act of piracy against the Spanish as it was one of discovery, capturing vast quantities of treasure and dramatically weakening King Philip II's hold on his empire. A century and a half later, the 18th century voyages of British explorer Captain James Cook would complete the map of the Pacific with scientific precision. On his 3 great voyages, Cook charted New Zealand and the eastern coast of Australia, claimed them for Britain, and became the first European to chart the Hawaiian Islands, all while accompanied by scientists who made invaluable observations in astronomy, botany, and ethnography. However, these legendary voyages also carried a dark shadow, serving as the vanguard for colonialism, the violent subjugation of indigenous populations, and the horrific transatlantic slave trade. The age of exploration did not simply discover a new world. It irrevocably linked all continents together in a single, often brutal global system, fundamentally reshaping economics, politics, demographics, and the very course of human history in ways that are still felt profoundly today. The age of exploration, while connecting the globe, also unveiled the terrifying scale of the planet and its capacity for human beings to simply vanish, leaving behind only whispers and questions. As world maps became more complete, the blank spaces did not disappear entirely. They merely migrated from the edges of continents to the margins of our understanding, manifesting as chilling mysteries. These are not stories of war or plague, but of silent enigmas where people, and sometimes entire communities, evaporated into thin air, defying explanation and haunting the historical record. Modern forensics and historical research have probed these cases, yet for many, the truth remains as elusive as ever, a testament to the enduring power of the unknown. From the earliest colonial outposts to the 20th century's most advanced expeditions, these accounts puzzle investigators and fascinate the public, standing as stark reminders of our own fragility against vast, indifferent forces. One of the earliest and most profound of these mysteries is the fate of the lost colony of Roanoke, established on Roanoke Island in modern-day North Carolina in 1587. Led by Governor John White, the settlement of over 100 men, women, and children was one of the first attempts at a permanent English colony in the New World. Faced with dwindling supplies and increasing tensions with local Native American tribes, White was forced to sail back to England for help, leaving behind his daughter and granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. His departure was tragically timed. The ongoing Anglo-Spanish War, including the Spanish Armada in 1588, delayed his return for 3 long years. When White finally made it back to Roanoke in 1590, he found a scene that has baffled historians for over 4 centuries. The colony was utterly deserted. The fort had been carefully dismantled, not destroyed in a conflict, and there were no signs of a struggle anywhere, no bodies, and no hastily dug graves. The only clue left behind was a single word carved into a post of the fort's palisade, quote, 28, quote. This was the name of a nearby island and a friendly Native American tribe, a potential destination the colonists might have sought for refuge. White had instructed the colonists that if they were to move, they should carve a Maltese cross into a tree to indicate they had left under duress. The absence of such a cross suggested the move was planned. Despite his desperate hopes, a storm forced White's ship to abandon its search, and he never saw his family or the colonists again, their fate becoming one of America's most haunting historical enigmas. Archaeological investigations in the centuries since have turned up compelling but ultimately inconclusive evidence. The most widely accepted theory is that the colonists, after being left to fend for themselves, split up and were assimilated into various local Native American communities, including the Croatoan and the Chowanoke, in order to survive. Some European-style artifacts found at indigenous sites lend credence to this hypothesis. Other theories posit a massacre by a more hostile tribe, like the Sokotan, or a failed attempt to sail back to England where they were lost at sea. Despite modern digs using ground-penetrating radar and DNA analysis of local descendants, no definitive proof of the colonists' collective fate has ever been discovered, leaving the story of Roanoke as a permanent, unresolved footnote in the saga of American exploration. Centuries later, the high seas would offer their own perplexing ghost story, that of the brigantine Mary Celeste, a ship found adrift and perfectly seaworthy in the Atlantic Ocean in December of 1872. The ship had departed from New York City a month earlier, bound for Genoa, Italy, carrying a cargo of 1,700 barrels of denatured alcohol and a crew of 10, including the experienced Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia. It was spotted by the crew of another ship, the Dei Gratia, about 400 miles east of the Azores Islands, sailing erratically with its sails slightly damaged but still set. When a boarding party from the Dei Gratia arrived, they found a vessel that was, in every practical sense, a perfectly functioning time capsule, but with no one aboard. The investigation of the Mary Celeste revealed a scene of profound normality that only deepened the mystery. The ship's single lifeboat was missing, suggesting the crew had abandoned the vessel. Yet this decision made no sense. The cargo was largely intact, with only 9 of the alcohol barrels opened, and the ship's 6-month supply of food and water was untouched. The crew's personal possessions, including valuables like the captain's navigational instruments and the ship's logbook, were still in place, contradicting any theory of piracy or mutiny. There were no clear signs of violence or struggle. The only evidence suggesting a problem was some water between the decks and a frayed rope that might have been used to tow the lifeboat. The 10 people aboard had simply vanished, leaving behind a seaworthy ship and a lifetime of unanswered questions. Over the decades, theories about the Mary Celeste have proliferated, ranging from the plausible to the fantastical. Early sensationalist accounts suggested attacks by sea monsters or alien abduction, but serious inquiries have focused on more grounded possibilities. A leading theory involves a fear of explosion from the ship's volatile alcohol cargo. Perhaps a leak or a loud rumbling from the barrels prompted the captain to order an evacuation into the lifeboat as a precaution, intending to trail the ship from a safe distance. In this scenario, a sudden squall or a faulty tow line could have separated the lifeboat from the Mary Celeste, dooming the crew to the open ocean. Other experts have proposed a crew mutiny that went wrong, or even that the crew, suffering from dehydration-induced madness, jumped overboard. Despite modern investigations and even a 2001 film study, no definitive explanation has ever been proven, cementing the Mary Celeste's legacy as the archetypal ghost ship. A similarly eerie disappearance occurred not on the high seas, but on a remote, wind-swept island in the North Atlantic, centered on the Flannan Isles Lighthouse off the west coast of Scotland. In December of 1900, the lighthouse was manned by a 3-man crew: James Ducat, the principal keeper, and 2 assistants, Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur. The supply ship Hesperus arrived on the 26th of December to drop off provisions and rotate the crew, but as it approached, the keepers noticed something was immediately wrong. No flag was flying to welcome them, no supplies had been left at the landing jetty for collection, and none of the 3 keepers were visible to signal the approaching vessel, which was standard procedure. When the relief keeper, Joseph Moore, was rowed ashore, he found the lighthouse and living quarters locked from the inside, a situation that defied all logic. Upon forcing the door, he discovered a scene of utter abandonment. The clocks had stopped, the fire in the kitchen grate had gone out, and a half-eaten meal of salted mutton and potatoes sat on the table. Upstairs, 2 of the 3 weatherproof oilskin coats were missing, while the 3rd remained on its hook. The lighthouse's logbook provided the only clue, with an entry from December 12th mentioning a severe storm with winds the likes of which I have never seen, and a final entry on the 15th noting the storm had passed and that the keeper had been praying. A subsequent official investigation could find no bodies, but speculated that a giant wave may have swept 2 men from the island's western landing stage while the 3rd ran to help, only for all 3 to be claimed by the raging sea. While the rogue wave theory is the most accepted, it has its own inconsistencies, as it does not explain why the lighthouse door was locked from the inside, or why the men would have ventured out in such ferocious conditions without their storm gear. The lack of bodies and the locked door have given rise to more speculative theories, involving everything from a fight between the keepers to supernatural encounters with sea creatures. The mystery of the Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers has since passed into Scottish folklore and even inspired a poem by Wilfred Wilson Gibson. But the ultimate fate of Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur remains one of the sea's most chilling and isolated enigmas. Perhaps the most bizarre and scientifically puzzling disappearance of the 20th century occurred not at sea, but in the frozen, remote wilderness of the northern Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union. In January of 1959, a group of 9 highly experienced ski hikers, led by Igor Dyatlov, set out on a challenging 14-day expedition to reach Mount Otorten. The group, consisting of 8 men and 2 women, were all seasoned athletes and students from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, well equipped to handle the harsh winter conditions. After their last communication from a mountain pass on January 31st, they failed to send their scheduled telegram, and when no word was heard for weeks, a massive search and rescue operation was launched. What the rescuers found on February 26th was a scene of inexplicable horror and dread. The hiker's tent was discovered on a slope of the mountain Kholat Syakhl, which in the local Mansi language means dead mountain. It was half covered in snow and had been cut open from the inside with a knife, indicating the occupants had fled in a state of panic. Footprints in the snow, some from bare feet, some from socks, led away from the tent down the slope toward a nearby forest, over a kilometer away. This was the first great mystery. Why would 9 experienced hikers, in temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius, deliberately abandon their only shelter and crawl into the dark, freezing forest? The first 2 bodies were found near the forest's edge, trying to return to the tent, while 3 more were discovered huddled together near a cedar tree, having died of hypothermia. The search for the remaining 4 would take another 2 months. In May, the last 4 bodies were found in a ravine deeper in the woods, and these discoveries deepened the mystery from a simple tragedy to something truly inexplicable. While these 4 had also died of hypothermia, they bore horrific injuries that were completely at odds with a simple death from cold. One man, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, had a massive skull fracture. 2 others, Lyudmila Dubanina and Semyon Zolotaryov, had severe, crushing chest injuries that were described by a doctor as being as great as the force of a car crash, yet there were no external wounds, no broken ribs, and no bruising on their skin. Most disturbingly, Lyudmila Dubanina was missing her tongue and her eyeballs. All 9 bodies were found with traces of radiation on their clothing, and some reports, though officially denied, claimed the bodies had an unnatural orange tan and gray hair. The official Soviet investigation closed the case in May of 1959, concluding that the group had died, quote, 32, quote. This vague and cryptic conclusion fueled decades of speculation. Theories have ranged from an avalanche, which doesn't explain the bizarre injuries or the tent being cut from within, a military weapons test involving paratroopers or concussive explosions, to an encounter with a group of hostile local Mansi people who were officially cleared of any involvement. More fringe theories invoke Yetis or UFOs. A 2019 Russian review of the case concluded that an avalanche was indeed the most likely cause, theorizing that a small slab avalanche panicked the group into fleeing the tent, and that subsequent injuries occurred as they fell into the ravine. However, this modern explanation still leaves many of the most damning questions unanswered, ensuring that the Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the most debated, terrifying, and truly unexplained phenomena of the modern era. Beyond the mysterious vanishings in isolated landscapes, history has been repeatedly reshaped by a different, far more pervasive and invisible enemy: disease. Pandemics have acted as a relentless force of natural selection, a demographic catastrophe, and a catalyst for profound social, political, and economic change. From the ancient world to the modern era, these microscopic adversaries have toppled empires, reshaped religions, and left indelible scars on the human psyche. Their stories are not merely tales of suffering, but also chronicles of scientific discovery, human resilience, and the ongoing battle against nature's most potent threats. The first truly well-documented pandemic to sweep across the known world arrived during the early Byzantine Empire, an event that would forever be known as the Plague of Justinian. Beginning in the year 541 AD, The pestilence emerged from the port city of Pelusium in Egypt and rapidly spread along the established trade routes of the Mediterranean Sea. Historical accounts from the Procopius of Caesarea, a court historian for Emperor Justinian, describe a disease of unprecedented lethality, with victims developing fevers, swelling buboes in the groin, armpits, or neck, and often succumbing within days. Modern scientific analysis has confirmed the identity of this killer, revealing that the plague of Justinian was caused by the same bacterium responsible for the later Black Death, Yersinia pestis. Researchers have successfully extracted and sequenced Y. pestis DNA from the dental pulp of victims buried in a 6th century cemetery in Bavaria, Germany, providing definitive proof. This ancient pandemic is estimated to have killed 25 to 50 million people, perhaps 13 to 26% of the world's population at the time, crippling the Byzantine army and economy, and halting Justinian's ambitious plans to reconquer the Western Roman Empire. Centuries after the world had slowly recovered, a descendant of this ancient plague returned with even more devastating fury, an event now etched in history as the Black Death. The pandemic is believed to have originated in the arid plains of Central Asia, where it then traveled along the Silk Road, reaching the Crimean Peninsula by 1343. One of the most apocalyptic accounts of its transmission involves the siege of the Genoese trading port of Kaffa, where the attacking Mongol army, reportedly decimated by the disease, catapulted plague-infested corpses over the city walls. This gruesome act of early biological warfare inadvertently infected the Genoese traders, who then fled to their home ports on merchant ships, unknowingly carrying the death sentence for all of Europe in their cargo holds and in the fleas aboard their vessels. By the summer of 1348, the Black Death had penetrated the continent, arriving in port cities like Messina in Sicily, Genoa, and Venice before spreading like wildfire inland. The disease had three primary manifestations: the bubonic form, characterized by painful swollen lymph nodes or buboes; the pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs and was spread through respiratory droplets; and the septicemic form, a near instantaneous infection of the bloodstream. The social fabric of medieval Europe completely unraveled under the strain, as panic, fear, and religious fervor swept the continent. Communities broke down, family members abandoned their loved ones, and doctors, clad in primitive beak-like masks filled with aromatic herbs, were largely powerless to stop the contagion. The psychological impact of the Black Death was as profound as the demographic one, leading to extreme and often violent social reactions across Europe. Groups known as the flagellants emerged, publicly whipping themselves in processions as a form of penance to appease God's wrath, a practice that was ultimately condemned by the papacy for its heretical nature. Simultaneously, a wave of violent persecution targeted minorities, particularly Jewish communities, who were falsely accused of poisoning wells and spreading the disease. These pogroms resulted in the massacre of thousands of Jews in cities like Strasbourg and Basel, a dark chapter of scapegoating that revealed the deep-seated xenophobia activated by mass panic. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, became a pervasive artistic theme, emphasizing the universality of mortality and the futility of earthly status in the face of such an indiscriminate killer. Economically, the Black Death paradoxically set the stage for profound long-term change, despite the immediate collapse of trade and agriculture. The massive loss of life, estimated to be between 30 to 60% of Europe's total population, created a severe labor shortage, which in turn dramatically increased the value and bargaining power of the surviving peasantry and working class. This shift gradually eroded the foundations of the feudal system, as serfs could now demand wages and better conditions from landowners desperate for their labor. Some historians argue that this social disruption was a key contributing factor to later historical movements, including the Renaissance and the peasants' revolts, fundamentally altering the power structures of European society for centuries to come. The Black Death was not merely an end, but a brutal, chaotic beginning for a new world. While bacterial plagues ravaged the Old World, another, even more persistent killer haunted humanity across the globe: The variola virus, the cause of smallpox. Smallpox is one of the oldest and most devastating diseases known to humankind, with evidence of its presence found in ancient Egyptian mummies, including Pharaoh Ramses V. The virus was exceptionally contagious and caused a horrific disease characterized by high fever, body aches, and a disfiguring rash of pustules that covered the body. For those who survived, which was only about 30%, permanent scarring and often blindness was the frequent outcome. For millennia, smallpox was a fact of life, a terrifying force that shaped childhood and dictated the rise and fall of populations. Remarkably, a primitive form of immunization against smallpox, known as variolation, had been practiced in China, India, and parts of Africa for centuries before it was known in Europe. This technique involved deliberately introducing material from a smallpox pustule, either by scratching it into the skin or inhaling it as a powder, to induce a milder form of the disease from which the patient would usually recover, gaining lifelong immunity. The practice was introduced to the West in the early 18th century by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, who had her own children variolated. While variolation carried a risk of causing a full-blown outbreak and was sometimes fatal, it represented the first crucial step in the scientific understanding of immunization and offered a significant reduction in mortality compared to natural infection. The true breakthrough in the fight against smallpox came in 1796 from the observations of an English country doctor named Edward Jenner. Jenner noticed that milkmaids who contracted a mild disease called cowpox, which caused sores on their hands but was not dangerous to humans, seemed to be immune to the deadly smallpox. To test his hypothesis, Jenner took pus from a cowpox sore on a milkmaid and scratched it into the arm of an 8-year-old boy, James Phipps. After the boy recovered from the mild cowpox infection, Jenner then exposed him to smallpox material multiple times, and the boy never developed the disease. This revolutionary procedure, which Jenner termed vaccination, from vacca, the Latin word for cow, was safer and more effective than variolation, and laid the groundwork for the entire field of modern immunology. Building on Jenner's discovery, the 19th and 20th centuries saw a global push to eradicate smallpox, a goal once considered impossible. In 1967, the World Health Organization launched an intensified eradication plan, using a new, more stable, freeze-dried vaccine and a strategy of mass vaccination and, quote, 36, quote. The strategy involved ring vaccinating every contact of an identified case, creating a buffer of immunity to stop the disease's spread. The last naturally occurring case of endemic smallpox was diagnosed in a hospital cook in Somalia in October 1977. In 1980, the World Health Assembly officially declared the world free of smallpox, a monumental achievement that stands as the only time a human disease has been completely eradicated by human effort. As the age of bacterial plagues faded, and humanity celebrated the victory over smallpox, a new and terrifyingly efficient viral killer emerged from the shadows of the First World War. The influenza pandemic of 1918, often misnamed the Spanish flu, was the most severe pandemic in recent history, infecting an estimated 1/3 of the world's population and claiming the lives of between 50 and 100 million people. The pandemic did not originate in Spain. The country was merely a neutral nation during the war, so its press was free to report on the outbreak's devastating toll, while warring countries censored such news to maintain morale. The true origins remain a subject of intense scientific debate, with theories pointing to a rural area in Kansas, a British Army base in France, or even northern China. What made the 1918 flu so uniquely catastrophic was not just its transmissibility, but its unusual mortality pattern, which formed a disturbing W-shaped curve when graphed by age. Unlike typical flu outbreaks, which disproportionately kill the very young and the very old, this strain struck down healthy young adults between the ages of 20 and 40 with terrifying ferocity. Scientists now believe this was due to a phenomenon called a cytokine storm, where the robust immune systems of these young adults overreacted to the virus, triggering a massive inflammatory response that filled their lungs with fluid and led to a rapid, often fatal pneumonia. Victims could go from perfectly healthy in the morning to dead by nightfall, their bodies turning a bluish gray from a lack of oxygen as they drowned in their own immune response. The pandemic swept across the globe in 3 distinct waves over a 2-year period, aided by the massive troop movements and demobilizations at the end of World War I. The first wave in the spring of 1918 was relatively mild. The second wave, which emerged in the autumn, was by far the most deadly, exploding with a vengeance in military camps like Camp Devens in Massachusetts and in civilian cities like Philadelphia, where a war bond parade led to thousands of new infections. A third, less severe wave occurred in the winter and spring of 1919. The sheer scale of death was overwhelming, with morgues overflowing, hospitals unable to cope, and grim scenes of families dying together with no one left to bury them. The pandemic killed more people in 25 weeks than AIDS has killed in 25 years, and more in 1 year than the Black Death killed in a century. In the decades following the 1918 pandemic, the influenza virus itself faded into relative obscurity as a global threat, largely because its genetic RNA was incredibly fragile and degraded quickly, making scientific study difficult. However, a breakthrough came in the late 1990s when a team of scientists led by Dr. Johan Holten successfully extracted and sequenced the virus's genetic code from the preserved lung tissue of a victim whose body had been buried in the permafrost of a remote Alaskan village. This remarkable achievement allowed virologists to reconstruct the virus and study its properties in high-security laboratories. Their research revealed that the 1918 strain was an H1N1 virus with a unique combination of genes that derived from an avian influenza source, explaining why the human population had no prior immunity and why it was so lethal. The legacy of these great pandemics is a sobering reminder of humanity's vulnerability to the microbial world. From the bacterium Yersinia pestis that crippled the Byzantine and medieval worlds to the influenza virus that brought the 20th century to its knees, these invisible forces have dictated the course of history as powerfully as any king or conqueror. Each outbreak spurred advancements in public health, from the concept of quarantine, first practiced in Venice during the Black Death, to the global surveillance networks and vaccine technologies developed in the wake of more recent crises. Yet, for all our scientific progress, the fundamental dynamics of a pandemic, novel pathogens, global travel, and social disruption remain the same. The story of human civilization is, in many ways, a continuous arms race against these ancient and ever-evolving enemies, a race where the stakes are the very survival of our societies. As the world grappled with the microscopic threats of pandemics, the 20th century was simultaneously being forged and shattered by colossal events born from human ambition, ideology, and conflict. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, ignited a diplomatic crisis that escalated into the First World War, a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality. This Great War saw the collapse of centuries-old empires, including the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, redrawing the political map of Europe and the Middle East. The nature of warfare itself was irrevocably changed by industrial killing technologies, from machine guns and heavy artillery to chemical weapons, leading to a protracted and bloody stalemate in the trenches of the Western Front. By the time the armistice was signed in 1918, over 16 million people were dead, and a generation was left psychologically scarred, sowing the seeds for future global discord. Emerging from the ruins of the Russian Empire, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 represented a seismic ideological shift that would define half the century. Spurred by the immense casualties and food shortages of World War I, the February Revolution forced the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, ending 300 years of Romanov rule. Later that year, the October Revolution saw Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik party seize power, promising peace, land, and bread to the war-weary masses. They established the world's first communist state, based on the principles of Marxism-Leninism, fundamentally challenging the global capitalist order. A brutal civil war followed, but the Bolsheviks' victory ultimately led to the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1922, a new superpower destined to be America's primary adversary for the next 70 years. The fragile peace of the 1920s was shattered by an economic catastrophe of global proportions, the Great Depression, which began with the Wall Street crash on October 29, 1929. This event triggered a domino effect of bank failures, plunging stock prices, and catastrophic unemployment that rippled across the interconnected world economy. In the United States, the unemployment rate soared to 25%, while in Germany, economic devastation created fertile ground for extremist political movements. Historians widely agree that the harsh reparations and economic humiliation imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, combined with the Depression, were critical factors in the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. The desperation and poverty of this era demonstrated how intimately linked global economies had become, and how economic collapse could directly fuel political radicalization and the march towards war. The ideological and economic tensions of the interwar period culminated in the Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history, which raged from 1939 to 1945. Sparked by Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland, the war soon engulfed the globe, featuring a clash of the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, against the Allied powers, led by Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. This was a total war, in which civilian populations and industrial infrastructure became primary targets, resulting in an estimated 70 to 85 million fatalities. The conflict witnessed pivotal battles that determined its course, from the Battle of Britain and Stalingrad to D-Day and the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific. The war ended with the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers, but left Europe and large parts of Asia in ruins, setting the stage for a new world order dominated by two opposing superpowers. Integral to the horrors of World War II was the Holocaust, the systematic, state-sponsored genocide of approximately 6 million European Jews by Nazi Germany. Under the coordination of Heinrich Himmler and the SS, the Nazi regime established a network of concentration and extermination camps, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor, for the sole purpose of industrial-scale murder. Historians have meticulously documented how this process evolved from initial persecution and ghettoization to the implementation of the final solution, a plan for the annihilation of the Jewish people. Millions of others, including Soviet prisoners of war, Polish and Soviet civilians, Romani people, disabled individuals, and political opponents, were also systematically murdered by the regime. The liberation of the camps in 1945 revealed the full, unimaginable scale of the atrocity to a horrified world, fundamentally altering concepts of human rights and leading to the Nuremberg trials to bring perpetrators to justice. The final act of World War II ushered in the nuclear age, a paradigm shift in human capability for self-destruction that continues to cast a long shadow over the world. The top-secret Manhattan Project, a monumental scientific and engineering effort led by J. Robert Oppenheimer and involving figures like Enrico Fermi, successfully developed the first atomic weapons. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, and 3 days later, a second on Nagasaki, instantly killing over 100,000 people and leading to Japan's surrender. Scientists and military leaders had unlocked a power so devastating that it fundamentally changed the nature of international relations and warfare. This event marked the beginning of the nuclear arms race, a terrifying competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to build ever more powerful arsenals. In the aftermath of the war, the world was rapidly polarized between two nuclear-armed blocs, giving rise to the nearly half-century-long ideological and geopolitical struggle known as the Cold War. Winston Churchill famously declared that an underscore, quote, 43 underscore, had descended across Europe, separating the democratic capitalist West from the communist authoritarian East, now dominated by the Soviet Union. This conflict was not fought directly between the superpowers, but through a series of proxy wars, espionage, propaganda campaigns, and a tense nuclear standoff. Key flashpoints included the Berlin blockade of 1948, the Korean War in the early 1950s, and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. According to political scientists, this bipolar world order defined global politics for decades, forcing nations to align with one side or the other while living under the constant threat of mutually assured destruction. A primary theater of competition during the Cold War was the space race, a contest for supremacy in spaceflight capability that served as a powerful proxy for technological and ideological superiority. The Soviet Union struck the first major blow on October 4, 1957, with the successful launch of Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, a moment that shocked and galvanized the United States. The Soviets followed this with another stunning achievement on April 12, 1961, when cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth. In response, President John F. Kennedy pledged in 1962 that the United States would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade, a goal that was realized on July 20, 1969, with the Apollo 11 mission. While framed as a triumph for all humanity, the moon landing was a decisive American victory in the space race, demonstrating immense technological and organizational power. Simultaneously, the mid-20th century witnessed the dramatic dismantling of European colonial empires, a process known as decolonization, which fundamentally reshaped the global map and international relations. The Second World War had severely weakened colonial powers like Britain and France, both economically and in terms of prestige, while also fueling nationalist movements across Asia and Africa. A landmark event was the independence of India and Pakistan in 1947, achieved after a long struggle led by Mahatma Gandhi, which set a powerful precedent for other colonies. Over the next 2 decades, dozens of new nations emerged in Africa, including Ghana in 1957 and Algeria in 1962, after a brutal war of independence, shifting the balance of power in the United Nations and creating what became known as the Third World. This wave of decolonization was not always peaceful, but it irrevocably ended the era of formal European imperial rule. The climax of the Cold War's ideological struggle came with the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, a momentous event that symbolized the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. The wall, constructed in 1961, had been the most potent physical symbol of the Iron Curtain, dividing East and West Berlin and preventing East Germans from fleeing to the West. Its fall was precipitated by the liberalizing reforms of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, particularly his policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, as well as by mass popular protests in East Germany and other Eastern Bloc countries. On that fateful night, confused border guards, overwhelmed by massive crowds, opened the checkpoints, allowing ecstatic East and West Berliners to pass through freely. This event led to the rapid reunification of Germany and, within 2 years, to the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself in 1991, formally ending the Cold War. As the century drew to a close, a different kind of revolution was underway, one grounded not in geography or politics, but in information and technology, laying the groundwork for the modern digital world. The origins of this transformation could be traced back to ARPANET, a network created by the U.S. Department of Defense in 1969 to ensure secure communication in the event of a nuclear attack. This experimental network gradually expanded to include universities and research institutions, forming the technical foundation for the Internet. The true breakthrough came in 1989 when British computer scientist Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN in Switzerland, invented the World Wide Web, a system of interlinked hypertext documents accessed via the Internet. Throughout the 1990s, the web exploded into public consciousness, fundamentally transforming commerce, communication, education, and culture, and connecting humanity in ways that were unimaginable just a few decades earlier. The dawn of the World Wide Web in the 1990s not only revolutionized communication, but also created a new, volatile frontier for financial speculation. leading to one of the first major economic crises of the digital age. Investors, captivated by the seemingly limitless potential of the internet, poured billions into technology startups, many of which had no viable business model or path to profitability. This period of intense optimism, often dubbed, quote, 45, quote, by economists, saw the technology-heavy NASDAQ index surge from under 500 points in 1995 to over 5,000 by March 10, 2000. The bubble was fueled by a belief that traditional metrics of valuation no longer applied in this new economy, creating a speculative frenzy detached from economic reality. When the bubble finally burst, it wiped out an estimated $5 trillion in market value over the next 2 years, leading to the bankruptcy of hundreds of companies and a mild recession in the United States. While the West was grappling with its tech-fueled mania, a different and devastating financial storm had already erupted in Asia, a crisis that exposed the vulnerabilities of emerging markets to rapid capital flows. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 began in Thailand, where decades of rapid economic growth had been financed by huge inflows of foreign troika, from record-shattering heat waves that bake continents to mega hurricanes that obliterate coastal cities. Our atmosphere is increasingly displaying a volatile and violent temperament. Climate scientists point to a clear correlation between the warming of the planet and the increasing frequency and severity of these events, a consequence of more energy being trapped in the Earth's system. This new era of climate-driven disasters represents a profound shift, where the background conditions of our civilization are themselves becoming a primary source of global crisis. One of the most insidious and lethal of these phenomena is the extreme heat wave, an event that can transform a thriving region into a death trap in a matter of days. The European heat wave of 2003 stands as a stark early warning of this new reality, a period of blistering temperatures that claimed an estimated 70,000 lives across the continent. Forests dried out and ignite spontaneously. Rivers like the Danube and Rhone shrank to historic lows, and infrastructure, from power grids to railway lines, buckled under the thermal stress. According to a study published in the journal Nature, this event was made at least twice as likely to occur due to human-induced climate change. It was a moment when the theoretical dangers of a warming planet became visceral and immediate, forever altering the political and scientific conversation in Europe. Less than a decade later, Russia experienced its own cataclysmic heat wave in the summer of 2010, an event so extreme it seemed to belong to a different geological epoch. For over a month, a persistent blocking high-pressure system parked itself over western Russia, shattering all-time temperature records and triggering a nationwide disaster. The heat and drought sparked over 10,000 wildfires, which burned vast areas of forest and peatland, choking major cities like Moscow in a toxic smog that doubled the city's mortality rate. The combination of heat and fire also led to a catastrophic failure of the grain harvest, prompting the Russian government to ban all wheat exports and sending shockwaves through global food markets. This event demonstrated how a climate anomaly in one major nation could cascade into a global food security and economic crisis. While heat waves bake the interiors, it is the world's oceans that are fueling some of the most powerful and destructive storms ever witnessed. Hurricane Katrina, which struck the Gulf Coast of the United States in August 2005, was a brutal demonstration of this power, not just as a natural disaster, but as a systemic failure of engineering and governance. Although it made landfall as a Category 3 hurricane, the storm's sheer size and the catastrophic failure of the levee system in New Orleans led to 80% of the city being flooded. Over 1,800 people lost their lives, and the images of stranded residents on rooftops and in the Superdome became iconic symbols of governmental incompetence and social inequality. Leading meteorologists agree that the abnormally warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico that summer intensified Katrina, providing the fuel for its destructive power and record-breaking storm surge. The trend of record-breaking storms continued relentlessly across the globe, with tropical cyclones reaching new levels of terrifying intensity. In November 2013, Super Typhoon Haiyan, known as Yolanda in the Philippines, became one of the most powerful tropical cyclones ever recorded at landfall. Packing sustained winds of over 195 miles per hour, it generated a storm surge of up to 20 feet that obliterate entire coastal towns, particularly in and around the city of Tacloban. The official death toll exceeded 6,000, with thousands more remaining missing, leaving one of the poorest regions of the Philippines in ruins. Experts believe that climate change is not necessarily increasing the number of typhoons, but is disproportionately making the strongest ones even more powerful, a phenomenon they call, quote, "This pattern was horrifyingly confirmed during the Atlantic hurricane season of 2017, which saw a relentless procession of devastating storms. Within the span of just a few weeks, Hurricane Harvey stalled over Texas, dumping over 60 inches of rain and causing catastrophic flooding in Houston, while Hurricane Irma became the strongest Atlantic Basin hurricane ever recorded, devastating the Leeward Islands and Florida. Immediately after, Hurricane Maria, another Category 5 storm, delivered a near-fatal blow to Puerto Rico, causing an estimated 3,000 deaths and leaving the island's power grid in shambles for months. According to researchers at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the abnormally warm ocean temperatures that year provided the immense energy required to fuel such a string of high-intensity storms. This season shattered the notion that such disasters are rare, once-in-a-lifetime events, suggesting a new and frightening normal for coastal communities. Beyond violent winds and storm surges, a warmer atmosphere also holds more moisture, leading to a dramatic increase in the frequency and severity of extreme rainfall and catastrophic flooding events. In the summer of 2010, and again in 2022, the nation of Pakistan was submerged by floods of almost unimaginable scale, affecting over 20 million people across a third of the country. The 2022 event was supercharged by a supercharged monsoon season and a glacier outburst event in the north, all amplified by unprecedented heat waves that had accelerated ice melt earlier in the year. Climate scientists have identified a phenomenon known as an atmospheric river as a key driver, a narrow corridor of concentrated water vapor transported in the atmosphere that can unleash torrents of rain. The slow-moving nature of these weather systems meant that the water had nowhere to go, transforming fertile plains into a vast inland sea and triggering a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. Europe, long considered a region of climatic stability, was also brutally reminded of its vulnerability in July 2001. A slow-moving weather system, dubbed a VB cyclone, stalled over Western Europe, dumping the equivalent of 2 months' worth of rain in just 48 hours over parts of Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The resulting flash floods were so violent that they swept away houses, bridges, and cars in a torrent of muddy debris, killing over 200 people in some of the most developed nations on Earth. The scale of the destruction in towns like Bad Neuenahr-Ahrweiler in Germany was shocking, as centuries-old infrastructure was simply no match for the sheer volume of water. Climate models had long predicted that global warming would increase the intensity of rainfall in this region, but the speed and ferocity of the 2001 event stunned even the most seasoned meteorologists. The opposite side of the hydrological coin, prolonged drought and the subsequent wildfires, has also reached terrifying new extremes, turning vast landscapes into tinderboxes. Australia's, quote, 54, quote, of 2019 and 2020 was a paradigm-shifting event, burning an estimated 59 million acres of land, an area larger than Florida. The fires were so massive that they created their own weather systems, including pyrocumulonimbus clouds, or, quote, 55, quote, which generated lightning and spawned new fires. A thick, toxic haze blanketed major cities like Sydney and Melbourne for weeks, and smoke plumes circumnavigated the globe, reportedly causing a temporary, measurable drop in global temperatures. Ecologists estimate that over 1 billion native animals were killed, pushing some species, like the koala, closer to extinction, and marking it as one of the worst wildlife disasters in modern history. Even more alarmingly, these wildfires have begun to occur in regions previously considered immune, such as the Arctic and subarctic, triggering a dangerous climate feedback loop. In recent years, massive wildfires have raged across Siberia, Alaska, and Greenland, burning through peat and permafrost that has been frozen for millennia. According to leading Arctic researchers, the burning of this ancient carbon-rich matter releases enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and, more critically, methane, a greenhouse gas over 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide in the short term. This release further warms the planet, which in turn thaws more permafrost and makes the region even more susceptible to fire. A vicious cycle known as the, quote, 56, quote. What were once rare events are now annual occurrences, with smoky skies in Siberia becoming a common summer feature, signaling a fundamental and potentially irreversible shift in the Earth's climate system. In a seeming paradox, a warming planet can also contribute to episodes of extreme cold, a phenomenon that initially confuses the public but has a clear scientific explanation. The brutal winter storm that crippled the state of Texas in February 2021 serves as a chilling case study. While the polar regions warm at a rate 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the planet, a phenomenon known as Arctic amplification. This temperature difference weakens the polar vortex, a band of strong winds that normally keeps frigid Arctic air locked up around the North Pole. A wobbly jet stream allows this cold air to spill southward, causing deep freezes and severe winter storms far from the Arctic. Experts believe that this destabilization of the jet stream is a direct consequence of rapid Arctic warming, meaning that extreme cold snaps can be a symptom, rather than a contradiction, of global warming. Perhaps the most terrifying new concept in climate science is that of compound events, where multiple climate-driven disasters occur in rapid succession or simultaneously, overwhelming any societal capacity to respond. The catastrophe that unfolded in Pakistan in 2022 is a textbook example of this dangerous new paradigm. The nation first endured a record-breaking spring heatwave, which accelerated the melting of Himalayan glaciers and primed the landscape for disaster. This was immediately followed by an unusually intense and prolonged monsoon season, which dumped unprecedented rainfall on the heat-blasted and water-saturated ground. The result was a monster monsoon on steroids, a one-two punch of heat and flood that created a humanitarian crisis far beyond the scope of a single event, a combination that climate models had only recently begun to predict. These escalating disasters carry an immense and escalating human and economic cost that extends far beyond the immediate damage, creating long-term instability and mass displacement. The World Bank estimates that climate change could force over 200 million people to migrate within their own countries by 2050, creating climate migrants and placing immense strain on social and political systems. The financial toll is equally staggering, with the insurance industry reporting that insured losses from natural catastrophes have consistently topped $100 billion in recent years. These events destroy critical infrastructure, decimate agricultural yields, disrupt global supply chains, and erase decades of economic development in vulnerable nations. As such, climate change is no longer just an environmental issue. It is a fundamental threat multiplier for poverty, conflict, and global instability. According to the sober consensus of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, these events are not the new normal, but rather the early stages of a rapidly accelerating crisis. Every fraction of a degree of warming brings with it an exponential increase in the risk of extreme weather, meaning that the disasters of the past decade will likely seem mild in comparison to what is to come. The foundational assumption of a stable climate, upon which all of modern human civilization is built, is now crumbling, replaced by an era of volatility and uncertainty. The challenge is no longer solely about reducing emissions to prevent future warming, but also about adapting to a world that is already profoundly and irrevocably changed. These record-breaking climate events are a clarion call, a signal that the Earth's systems are reaching tipping points, and the ultimate test of human endurance is yet to begin. This ultimate test of human endurance is not a future concept, but a present reality, played out in countless dramatic stories of survival against impossible odds. Leading physiologists and psychologists study these incredible cases, seeking to understand the precise margins of human capability and the mysterious, quote, 62, quote, that can make the difference between life and death. The human body, while fragile, possesses a surprising array of hidden reserves and autonomic responses designed for extreme situations. These include the mammalian diving reflex, which slows the heart rate and constricts blood vessels in the extremities to conserve oxygen for the brain and vital organs. Scientists believe these ancient biological programs are a key reason why humans can survive conditions that seem, by all logical measures, too unsurvivable. Psychologically, survival hinges on a complex interplay of hope, discipline, and the ability to manage crippling fear and despair. Experts in survival psychology note that a common trait among survivors is the ability to break down an overwhelming long-term crisis into a series of small, manageable, immediate tasks. Instead of focusing on the months ahead, a survivor might focus only on finding the next drink of water, building the next small shelter, or taking the next step. This mental compartmentalization prevents the mind from being paralyzed by the sheer scale of the disaster. It is a profound behavioral adaptation that transforms a seemingly impossible situation into a sequence of achievable goals. One of the most harrowing and well-documented examples of this principle is the story of the Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, which crashed into the remote Andes Mountains in October 1972. Of the 45 people on board, 29 survived the initial impact, only to be faced with a new, silent enemy. The brutal environment at over 11,000 feet. With no food and inadequate clothing, the survivors were forced to endure sub-zero temperatures and the psychological horror of their isolation. After 72 days, only 16 would be rescued, their survival a testament to both incredible physical endurance and an unthinkable collective decision. The physical ordeal was extreme. The survivors melted snow for water, huddled together for warmth, and slowly starved as their search parties failed to find them. Medical analysis of the survivors later showed they had lost nearly half of their body weight, pushing their bodies to the very limits of human starvation. To stay alive, they were ultimately forced to resort to cannibalism, consuming the flesh of their deceased friends and teammates, a decision they reached after agonizing moral and spiritual debate. This choice, while horrific, was a calculated act of survival, driven by the primal biological imperative to live and the hope of being rescued for the sake of their waiting families. Their final act of endurance was an expedition by two of the strongest survivors, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, who decided to climb a towering 17,000-foot peak and hike for 10 days to find help. Armed with little more than a homemade sleeping bag and the knowledge that everyone else would die if they failed, they pushed their bodies beyond every conceivable limit. Parado, driven by the desire to see his father again, later described the expedition as a constant battle between a body screaming to stop and a mind that refused to quit. Their eventual encounter with a Chilean herder and the subsequent rescue of the remaining 14 survivors became a global phenomenon, redefining the very meaning of resilience. A different but equally profound test of endurance was faced by Aaron Ralston, an American outdoorsman, in April 2003. While hiking alone in a remote slot canyon in Utah, an 800-pound boulder dislodged, pinning his right arm and trapping him against the canyon wall. For 5 days, Ralston was completely alone, with limited water and no hope of anyone finding him in that desolate location. He meticulously documented his predicament, carving his name and date of birth into the rock and recording goodbye messages to his family on his video camera, fully expecting to die. Facing certain death from dehydration and exposure, Ralston's survival instinct eventually presented a gruesome, unthinkable solution. He would have to amputate his own arm. Using a dull multi-tool knife, he spent nearly an hour cutting through the skin, tendons, and finally the bone of his forearm, a procedure of unimaginable pain and determination. After freeing himself, he rappelled down a 65-foot cliff and hiked for over 5 miles before being miraculously found by a Dutch honeymooning couple. His story, immortalized in the film 127 Hours, is a stark example of an individual's capacity to overcome physical agony and psychological despair through sheer force of will. Survival from the sky also presents its own unique set of challenges, as demonstrated by the incredible story of Juliane Koepke in December 1971. When the Lockheed Electra plane she was on disintegrated in a thunderstorm over the Peruvian Amazon, she fell nearly 10,000 feet, still strapped into her seat. Remarkably, she survived the fall with only a broken collarbone, a gash on her arm, and a swollen eye, her fall perhaps cushioned by the dense jungle canopy and the spiral of the seat as it descended. Waking up alone in the immense, rain-soaked rainforest, her real ordeal had just begun. For 11 days, the 17-year-old German girl, who had grown up in the jungle, used her parents' teachings to navigate the treacherous environment. She followed a small creek downstream, knowing it would eventually lead to a larger body of water and potentially civilization. She waded through the water, which protected her from the swarms of insects, but her open wound became infested with maggots. Starving and on the verge of collapse, she finally stumbled upon a small canoe and a shelter, where she was found by a group of lumberjacks who treated her wounds and transported her to a town, becoming the sole survivor of the crash. The vast, empty expanse of the ocean presents another ultimate survival challenge, a battle fought not against mountains or jungle, but against the sun, salt, and one's own mind. In November 1942, Chinese sailor Poon Lim was working as a steward on the British merchant ship Ben Lomond when it was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Brazil. After the ship sank in 2 minutes, Poon Lim found himself alone on a small wooden raft in the middle of the South Atlantic, with only a few tins of biscuits, a 40-liter jug of water, and a flashlight. His journey of survival had begun, one that would last for an incredible 133 days. Poon Lim established a strict daily routine to maintain his sanity and physical health, which included exercises like swimming around the raft to keep his muscles strong. He rationed his food and water with meticulous discipline, and when his supplies ran out, he learned to survive by catching fish, collecting rainwater in a canvas tarp, and even drinking the blood of the birds he managed to catch. He saw several ships and planes, but was unable to attract their attention, leading to waves of crushing disappointment. On his 133rd day at sea, he was finally rescued by a Brazilian fishing family off the coast of Brazil. A living skeleton, but alive, holding the record for the longest survival on a life raft. What remains a profound mystery to researchers is why some individuals, like Poon Lim or Juliane Koepke, endure while others, sometimes in the very same situation, succumb. Is it merely a matter of random chance, physical fitness, or prior knowledge? Or is there a quantifiable psychological factor, a specific survival gene, or an unbreakable spiritual core that sets them apart? Scientists have identified traits like optimism, adaptability, and a strong sense of purpose as common among survivors, but these are difficult to measure and predict. The will to live remains one of the most powerful and elusive forces in human biology. A conscious choice to continue fighting when every instinct signals defeat. Modern research into neuroplasticity suggests that the brain can be trained for resilience, that individuals can learn to manage fear and reframe negative thoughts in a crisis. Military special forces units, for instance, undergo intensive survival training that simulates extreme stress, not just to teach practical skills, but to psychologically inoculate them against the shock and despair of a real-life survival scenario. They are taught to focus on what they can control, to maintain a positive mental attitude, and to never, ever give up hope. This training underscores a critical truth. While our physical limits are formidable, our psychological limits are often what truly define the boundaries of human endurance. These individual stories of incredible survival are more than just tales of luck or heroism. They are profound lessons in the boundless capacity of the human spirit. They serve as powerful microcosms for the collective challenge now facing humanity in an era of escalating climate and geopolitical instability. As we confront the compound events and systemic shocks of the 21st century, the same qualities that allowed a few to survive against all odds, resilience, adaptability, cooperation, and an unyielding will to live, will be required of our entire global civilization. The ultimate test of human endurance is no longer just a personal one, it is a shared one, and its outcome will define our legacy for millennia to come.